Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, where curiosity gets comfortable and history is allowed to take its time. Tonight, we are travelling back more than 5,000 years to a place of rivers, rice fields, earthen walls, carefully carved jade, and a city that remained hidden beneath the ground for thousands of years. It stood in the lower Yangtze region of what is now eastern China, not far from modern Hangzhou, and it belonged to a society we now call Liangzhu. Before we go any farther, where are you listening from tonight? Are you somewhere quiet with the day finally beginning to slow down, or are you still surrounded by traffic, messages, and a household that has chosen this exact moment to become unusually energetic? And had you heard the name Liangzhu before you found this video, there is no wrong answer. In fact, if the name is completely new to you, you are in very good company. If you enjoy calm journeys through the past, and you find this kind of history soothing rather than suspiciously educational, you can give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps more people find this quiet corner of the internet, including those who would like to learn about ancient civilizations without being shouted at by dramatic music every 12 seconds. Now settle in, and let us begin with a simple problem. When people hear the words ancient China, they often think of emperors, dynasties, bronze vessels, the Great Wall, or perhaps a very busy terracotta army standing patiently in neat rows. Those are important parts of the story, but they come much later. Long before the first imperial government, before the earliest surviving Chinese historical records, and before the great bronze centres of the Shang dynasty, large communities were already building, farming, organising labour, practicing rituals, and creating objects that required extraordinary skill. Liangzhu was one of those communities, although calling it simply a community makes it sound rather like a village committee with excellent pottery. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of a planned urban centre, substantial earthen walls, an enormous raised platform, elite cemeteries, specialised jade production, extensive rice cultivation, and a large water management system built across the surrounding landscape. UNESCO describes the site as the centre of power and belief of an early regional state that existed from about 3300 to 2300 BCE. Its economy rested on rice agriculture, while its burials and ritual objects show strong social differences and a shared system of belief. That date deserves a moment of attention. Liangzhu flourished more than 1,000 years before the better-known bronze civilization of the Shang dynasty. Its main period also overlaps with the age when large urban societies were developing in Mesopotamia, and it began centuries before the major pyramids of Egypt were built. This does not mean that these distant societies were all the same, or that they were participating in one shared ancient building competition. It means that complex societies were appearing in several parts of the world, each shaped by its own environment, food supply, political choices, and local traditions. The Liangzhu world developed around the lower reaches of the Yangtze River, especially in the area around Lake Tai. Today, this region includes parts of Zhejiang and Jiangsu provinces and the municipality of Shanghai. It is a wet landscape of plains, waterways, low hills, and fertile ground. Water offered transport, fish, irrigation, and productive rice fields. It also brought floods, saturated soil, and the occasional reminder that rivers are useful only until they decide to rearrange your neighbourhood. People had lived in the broader region long before Liangzhu appeared. Farming communities had gradually learned how to manage rice, build settlements, shape pottery, work wood, and use the network of streams and wetlands around them. Liangzhu did not arrive suddenly as a finished civilization. It grew from earlier local societies and inherited generations of practical knowledge. What changed was the scale. Settlements became more closely connected. Labour was organised across larger areas. Important places were rebuilt and enlarged. Social differences became more visible. Certain people were buried with remarkable objects while others received far less. At the centre of this growing system stood the site now known as Liangzhu Ancient City. Yet for most of history, nobody knew the city was there. There were no surviving chronicles naming its rulers, no royal list waited on a stone wall. No readable archive explained who ordered the dams, who supervised the rice stores, or who had the unenviable task of checking whether several kilometres of wet earth had been packed correctly. The buildings were largely made from earth and wood, rather than great blocks of stone. Wood decays, earthworks flatten, rivers deposit layers of sediment, farmers reshape fields, towns expand. A city can disappear without being carried away, simply by becoming part of the ground. The modern story of Liangzhu began in 1936, when Xi Xingeng, working with the Westlake Museum, investigated prehistoric remains near Liangzhu town. Early excavations revealed black pottery and other material that did not belong to the known historical periods. In 1959, the archaeologist Xianai formally used the name Liangzhu culture for this archaeological tradition. That gave researchers a label, but it did not immediately reveal the full scale of the society they were studying. The ancient city itself was identified only in 2007, followed by further recognition of its outer areas and, later, the extensive water management system around it. This slow discovery is one reason Liangzhu is still unfamiliar to many people. Archaeology rarely provides a complete picture in one convenient afternoon. It develops through surveys, trenches, soil samples, radiocarbon dates, microscopic plant remains, broken tools, post holes, burial patterns, and many meetings in which specialists politely disagree about a patch of earth. One excavation may reveal a wall, another may show that the wall continued farther than expected. A set of raised mounds may turn out to be part of a planned system rather than natural ground. A few jade objects may lead to a cemetery, and the cemetery may reveal a social hierarchy that nobody had suspected. During the 20th century, major discoveries steadily changed how researchers understood Liangzhu. Excavations at elite cemeteries such as Fanshan and Yaoshan revealed graves filled with finely worked jade. The objects were not merely decorative jewellery. Many followed repeated forms and designs, suggesting established ritual practices and recognised symbols of status. Among the best known are Cong, usually described as tubes with square outer sections and circular openings, and Bai, flat discs with central holes. Some pieces carry a repeated face-like design combining human and animal features. The exact beliefs behind these images are still debated, but the repetition is important. It suggests that Liangzhu communities shared a visual language that connected authority, ritual, and identity. Jade is difficult to work. It cannot simply be chipped into shape like flint. It must be cut, ground, drilled, and polished through patient abrasion. Producing a large, precise object demanded raw material, tools, skill, and a great deal of time. A single impressive piece may represent many days or months of labour. A grave containing numerous jades therefore tells us more than the fact that one person owned attractive things. It points to specialists, access to valuable material, control over production, and a society capable of directing labour toward objects that were not needed for everyday farming or cooking. The contrast between graves makes the message clearer. Some people were buried with many high-quality ritual objects. Others were buried with ordinary goods or very little at all. The dead did not enter the ground on equal terms. Archaeologists use such differences cautiously, because grave goods do not provide a complete instruction manual for a society. Still, when burial inequality appears alongside a planned city, large public works, specialised crafts, and control of food production, it becomes difficult to describe Liangzhu as a collection of simple farming villages. At the centre of the ancient city was Mojiaoshan, a huge artificial platform built from packed earth. Structures once stood on top of it, although the wooden buildings themselves have not survived. Researchers interpret this central area as a likely palace or administrative complex. Nearby lay the Fanshan cemetery, where some of the richest burials were found. The placement matters. High-status ritual burials were closely associated with the monumental centre, linking political authority, sacred practice, and the physical layout of the city. Around this core were walls built mainly from rammed or packed earth, with stone foundations in some areas. The inner city covered roughly 2.8 square kilometres, several times the area enclosed by Beijing's Forbidden City, although the comparison is only about size, not building style or political structure. Beyond the inner enclosure, archaeologists identified additional occupation and an outer city. Liangzhu was not a lonely ceremonial platform surrounded by empty countryside. It was part of a broad settlement system with homes, workshops, waterways, fields, storage areas, cemeteries and communities spread across the region. The surrounding hydraulic works made the scale even more striking. Archaeologists found high dams near valley mouths, lower dams across the plain, and long raised features that helped control and move water. These constructions served several possible purposes, including flood control, water storage, irrigation, and transport. They were not created by a few households filling spare weekends. Building them required planning, knowledge of the terrain, access to materials, coordinated labour, and some authority capable of persuading many people to move large quantities of earth. Recent archaeological work has helped researchers outline a sequence in which scattered settlements developed first, water management works followed, and the ancient city emerged as the system became more centralised. This matters because it shows that Liangzhu's urban centre was tied to the management of the wider landscape. The city did not simply sit beside the environment. Its people altered water routes, raised ground, protected fields, and turned a difficult wetland setting into the foundation of a powerful regional society. Rice was central to that foundation. Intensive rice agriculture could support a large population, but only when planting, harvesting, storage, water supply and labour were handled effectively. Archaeologists have found remains connected with rice cultivation and storage across Liangzhu sites. Food surplus would have allowed some people to work as craft specialists, builders, ritual leaders, or administrators instead of spending every day producing their own meals. It would also have given whoever controlled storage and distribution considerable influence. The person holding the grain account may not look as impressive as the person wearing the jade, but history has repeatedly shown that the key to power is often knowing where the food is kept. This combination of urban planning, water engineering, agricultural surplus, specialised craft production, shared ritual symbols and social hierarchy is why many researchers describe Liangzhu as an early state or an early civilization. The word civilization can be troublesome because it has often been used as a compliment for some societies and an insult toward others. Archaeologists today tend to use more specific evidence. Was there a large and organised settlement? Did institutions coordinate labour beyond the household? Were resources distributed unequally? Did specialists produce goods that circulated through a wider political or ritual system? Were large projects maintained over time? At Liangzhu, the answer to all of these questions appears to be yes. One feature is missing from the usual popular checklist: a confirmed system of writing. A small number of marks and symbols have been found on Liangzhu objects, but scholars have not established them as a fully developed script. That absence partly explains why Liangzhu has received less public attention than later Chinese societies. Written records give us names, arguments, taxes, battles, complaints, and the occasional official who seems to have spent an alarming amount of time counting livestock. Without texts, Liangzhu cannot introduce itself. Its people speak through the layout of foundations, the contents of graves, traces of rice, marks on jade, and the engineering hidden beneath later soil. There is another reason the name can be overlooked. Traditional accounts of early Chinese civilization often focused heavily on the Yellow River basin in northern China, especially on cultures seen as predecessors of the Xia, Shang, and Zhou dynasties. Those dynasties were central to later historical memory, so the north naturally occupied a large part of the story. Archaeology has complicated that older picture. The development of civilization in ancient China was not a single straight line beginning in one place. Different regions built complex societies, exchanged goods and ideas, competed, declined, and influenced later traditions in ways that are still being studied. Liangzhu is especially important because it demonstrates that the lower Yangtze was not a distant sporting area waiting for civilization to arrive from somewhere else. More than 5,000 years ago, people there were already creating a major political and ritual centre based on rice agriculture. They managed water on a large scale, constructed an urban landscape, and produced a jade tradition whose forms continued to matter long after Liangzhu itself had disappeared. UNESCO recognised the archaeological ruins of Liangzhu city as a World Heritage Site in 2019, specifically noting its contribution to understanding the origins of Chinese civilization and its evidence for the transition from smaller Neolithic communities to a large, integrated political unit. Calling Liangzhu the first Chinese civilization nobody talks about is therefore useful, but it needs a little care. First depends on what evidence we require, which region we examine, and how we define civilization. Other complex Neolithic societies existed in what is now China, and researchers continue to debate the relationships among them. Liangzhu does not need to win a contest in order to matter. Its real importance lies in how complete the evidence has become. Here we find a city, a regional settlement network, an engineered landscape, a food base, clear social ranking, elite ritual, and highly organised production, all appearing together at a remarkably early date. The people themselves remain harder to see. We do not know what language they spoke. We do not know what they called their city, because Liangzhu is the modern place name used by archaeologists. We do not know the names of rulers, builders, farmers, jade workers, boat operators, or the children who probably ignored sensible instructions near the water with the same determination children display today. Genetic studies, environmental research, microscopic analysis, and future excavations may reveal more, but there will always be limits. Even so, ordinary life leaves traces. Houses require posts. Meals leave grains, bones, shells, and broken vessels. Tools wear down. Fires alter soil. People lose objects in inconvenient places. Floors are repaired. Ditches fill. Burials preserve choices about identity and status. Archaeology collects these small pieces and asks how they fit together. At Liangzhu, the pieces have gradually formed a picture of a society that was organised, productive, unequal, technically capable, and deeply invested in ritual. Picture the region at its height. Boats move along waterways carrying rice, timber, reeds, clay, stone, and people. Farmers work fields beyond the raised urban areas. Labourers repair embankments before heavy rains. Craftspeople spend long hours grinding jade with sand and water, checking the symmetry of a form that cannot be rushed. Smoke rises from cooking fires. Officials or local leaders oversee stores and work groups. Ceremonies take place on platforms and near elite graves. The walls do not resemble the later stone fortifications familiar from historical dramas. They are broad constructions of earth, impressive because of the volume of material and labour involved. Nothing about this scene requires us to imagine a peaceful paradise. Large public works can protect communities, but they also reveal the ability to command labour. Rich burials can display shared beliefs, but they also expose inequality. Agricultural surplus can feed specialists and support cultural achievement, but it can be collected, controlled, and withheld. Liangzhu's success depended on cooperation, organisation, and technical knowledge. It may also have depended on pressure, obligation, and authority. Without written testimony, archaeology can show the structure more clearly than the personal experience. That tension makes Liangzhu more interesting, not less. It was neither a mysterious lost kingdom built by unknowable geniuses, nor a simple village that happened to own some attractive jade. It was a human society solving practical problems while creating new ones. Its people needed food, dry ground, transport, safety, social order, and reasons to accept that order. They responded by reshaping the landscape and building institutions strong enough to last for centuries. The city eventually declined around 2300 BCE, and the causes remain debated. Environmental evidence points towards serious changes involving water and flooding, but no single explanation has settled every question. We will reach that later. For now, it is enough to know that the disappearance of Liangzhu's political centre did not erase its importance. Its remains stayed beneath fields and settlements while later Chinese history unfolded elsewhere. The absence of a surviving dynasty did not make the achievement smaller. It only made the evidence quieter. To understand how this city became possible, we need to move beyond its walls and look closely at the place that supported it. The lower Yangtze was fertile, but it was never effortless. Water had to be read, redirected, stored, crossed, and sometimes resisted. Rice had to be planted in wet soil, protected through the growing season, harvested, processed, and kept for later use. Hills supplied some materials, plains offered others, and waterways connected communities that would otherwise have been separated by difficult ground. That landscape was not merely the background to Liangzhu. It shaped where people lived, what they ate, how they travelled, what they built, and how much cooperation survival required. Long before the great walls and rich graves appeared, families were already learning the habits of river and field. Their accumulated knowledge created the conditions from which the city could grow, and that is where the story now needs to go. Into the wet plains, the rice paddies, and the network of water that raised Liangzhu before it ever threatened to bring it down. To understand how Liangzhu became possible, it helps to forget the city for a while and look at the ground beneath it. The lower Yangtze region did not offer its inhabitants a neat stretch of dry farmland waiting to be planted. It was a low, wet landscape shaped by rivers, lakes, marshes, seasonal rain, coastal change, and the steady movement of sediment. Water was everywhere. It supplied food, carried boats, softened soil, and made rice cultivation possible. It also flooded settlements, drowned crops, weakened buildings, and turned an ordinary journey into a long discussion about mud. Liangzhu stood in the area surrounding Lake Tai, near the eastern foothills of the Tianmu Mountains. To the west were higher lands and narrow valleys. To the east lay flatter plains crossed by streams and waterways. Farther out, the wider Yangtze Delta was still developing through natural processes that had begun thousands of years earlier. Sea levels had risen after the last ice age, coastlines had shifted, and river sediments gradually helped transform parts of the region from open or brackish water into enclosed wetlands and freshwater environments. By the time Liangzhu society reached its height, people were living in a landscape that was productive but unstable. Success depended on knowing where water would collect, where soil could be raised, and when a useful channel might become a dangerous one. The climate was warm and humid. Pollen recovered from archaeological sediments suggests that mixed evergreen and deciduous broad-leaved forests grew around lakes and swamps. Trees, reeds, grasses, and wetland plants would have formed a dense environment beyond the cleared settlement areas. The people of Liangzhu did not face an empty plain. They occupied a place already full of life, much of it edible, useful, noisy, or interested in eating the crops before the farmers could get to them. Rivers were the main routes through this world. Moving heavy material over saturated ground is difficult even with modern equipment. In a society without paved roads, wheeled carts suitable for every surface, or an impatient delivery driver sending messages from 3 streets away, boats and canals offered the most practical means of transport: timber, clay, rice, stone, building earth, and people could all move by water. Settlements placed near channels were connected to neighbouring communities, fields, hills, and resource zones. A river was a road, a food source, a boundary, a drain, and occasionally an uninvited guest in the living area. Archaeologists have identified a network of waterways around the Liangzhu city site. Some channels followed natural courses, while others were modified or incorporated into the planned landscape. Waterways separated and connected parts of the settlement at the same time. They allowed boats to pass through areas where walking would have been slow, especially during wet seasons. They may also have carried construction materials toward the city and food towards storage and residential zones. This helps explain why Liangzhu's planners did not simply try to remove water, they used it. The challenge was not to create a completely dry world, which would have been both difficult and rather unhelpful for rice. The challenge was to decide where water should go, how quickly it should move, and how much of it should remain. Rice made this relationship much more important. The lower Yangtze was one of the central regions in the long history of rice domestication. Farming had developed there over many generations before Liangzhu emerged. Earlier communities experimented with planting, harvesting, processing, and selecting rice. Through repeated cultivation, domesticated forms became increasingly important. By Liangzhu times, rice agriculture was no longer a small supplement to hunting and gathering. It was the economic base of a large regional society. UNESCO identifies rice cultivation as one of the defining foundations of the early states centered at Liangzhu. The city, its surrounding settlements, its monuments, and its specialized crafts all depended in some way on the ability of farmers to produce enough food for people who were doing something other than farming. A rice grain is small, but producing thousands of baskets of rice is not a small undertaking. Fields have to be prepared. Seed must be selected and planted. Water levels need to be watched. Weeds compete with the crop. Birds and rodents do not respect human ownership. Harvesting has to happen at the right time, after which the grain must be processed, dried, transported and stored. Tools need repair. Workers need food while they work. Someone has to keep an eye on the weather, and someone else has to discover that the birds have already found the field and appear to be enjoying the arrangement enormously. If water comes too early, too late, too quickly, or not at all, the result can be poor. Rice cultivation in wet fields therefore tied daily labour to the behaviour of the landscape. Farmers could not simply plant the crop and return several months later to see how everything had gone. Water had to be managed throughout the growing cycle. We should be careful about imagining every Liangzhu field as a modern paddy with straight borders and perfectly controlled irrigation. Agricultural methods varied across time and place, and the archaeological evidence does not provide a daily farming manual. Some fields may have relied heavily on natural wetlands and seasonal flooding. Others were more deliberately shaped and managed. What is clear is that cultivation became intensive enough to leave strong traces. Pollen and charcoal records show that rice agriculture flourished during the Liangzhu period. Archaeologists have also found preserved paddy soils, rice remains, field boundaries, ditches, wells and channels connected with agricultural activity. These were not people scattering a little grain near a marsh and hoping for the best. They were managing fields repeatedly and adjusting the landscape to support production. The work probably followed a demanding seasonal routine. Fields had to be cleared or maintained before planting. Soil and water conditions were checked as the weather changed. During the growing season, families watched the crop and dealt with weeds, pests and damage. Harvest brought concentrated labour because ripe grain cannot wait indefinitely for everyone to finish their other plans. Rice was cut, gathered, processed, and moved away from damp fields. Some was eaten, some stored, and some kept for future planting. The entire process required judgment built through experience. People learned the signs of approaching rain, the behaviour of different soils, and which low places held water longer than expected. This knowledge would not have been written in books. It passed through demonstration, correction, memory, and repeated work. Children growing up near the fields learned which plants were crops and which were weeds. They learned how to move through shallow water without dropping tools, how to handle grain, and how to recognise a change in the sky that meant the day's schedule was about to become more urgent. Farming skill was tied to particular places. A channel that worked well in one area might be useless in another. A low field might need drainage after heavy rain, while a slightly higher one might require water to be directed toward it. Farmers needed a detailed understanding of small differences in ground level. In a flat wetland, a change of a few centimetres can decide whether a crop receives enough water or quietly becomes part of a pond. Rice was central, but it was not the only food available. Wetlands and rivers supported fish, shellfish, turtles, water plants, and birds. Forest edges and higher ground offered fruits, nuts, fuel, timber, and animals that could be hunted. Animal husbandry was also practiced, especially the raising of pigs, though the balance between farming, fishing, hunting, and livestock varied across the wider Liangzhu cultural region. A person living near Liangzhu may have eaten rice often, but meals would have changed with season, status, and location. Fish could be caught from nearby water, plants could be collected from wetlands and woodland. Pigs converted household scraps and agricultural byproducts into meat, although they also required care and had a talent for going where they were not invited. Food preparation involved pottery vessels, hearths, wooden implements, woven baskets, and containers that rarely survive as well as jade. The grander objects received more attention in museums, but most days were supported by ordinary tools and repetitive tasks. Someone had to clean the grain, carry the water, mend the basket, stir the pot, and discover that the firewood was damp at exactly the wrong moment. Plant remains from Liangzhu settlements show that people used more than rice. Archaeobotanical work at the Jamukun site found evidence of a warm, humid wetland environment in which domesticated rice was the main cereal, while fruits, melons, vegetables, and gathered plants also contributed to the available food supply. This varied diet helped communities use different parts of the landscape, rather than depending entirely on one kind of field. Even so, rice created possibilities that gathered resources alone could not provide at the same scale. A dependable crop could feed more people within a limited area. Grain could be stored longer than fresh fish or many collected plants. Stored food supported workers who were building walls, raising platforms, making jade, conducting rituals, or organising other people's work. It also made taxation, tribute, or required contributions possible. Once food could be collected in larger quantities, control over that food became a form of authority. A household might produce more rice than it needed immediately, but that did not mean the household necessarily decided how all of the surplus would be used. The archaeological evidence suggests that Liangzhu production went beyond household subsistence. Extensive ancient rice fields have been excavated at Maoshan, a settlement east of the main Liangzhu centre. The fields show a significant change over time. Earlier plots were relatively small and irregular. Later fields became much larger, with pathways, ditches, wells, creeks, and other facilities used to manage water. Some of the later fields reached roughly 1,000 or 2,000 square metres, while the entire excavated farming area expanded to several hectares. This was not simply an increase in the amount of planted ground. It represented a change in organisation. Larger fields required more labour, more coordinated water management, and clearer decisions about when and how work would be done. The Maoshan fields were built between higher ground and the low alluvial plain. Houses and burials stood on the slope nearby, while farming took place below. Natural and human-made waterways connected the fields with the surrounding area. Wells were dug within or near plots, and small outlets linked some fields to creeks. This arrangement shows farmers working with differences in height and water flow. They chose land that could receive moisture while still being managed. It was a compromise between ground that was too dry for efficient wet rice farming and ground that was so wet it would be better suited to fish. Over time, the scale of farming increased. This may have been encouraged by stable environmental conditions during part of the Liangzhu period. A relatively manageable water table allowed farmers to expand fields and build more complex irrigation features. It also gave settlements greater confidence that the labour invested in preparing land would produce a useful harvest rather than a fine collection of submerged pathways. Large-scale rice farming supported food storage. Archaeologists have uncovered substantial concentrations of rice associated with the Liangzhu centre, including remains interpreted as stored grain. Some estimates describe enormous quantities once kept near the central platform area. Whether every estimate can be made with perfect precision is less important than the general evidence. Liangzhu possessed the ability to gather and store food on a scale far beyond one household's needs. Storage changed the relationship between one harvest and the next. A poor season did not automatically become a disaster if enough grain remained from earlier production. Reserves could feed builders, craftspeople, ritual specialists, visitors, and administrators. They could support large gatherings or help communities survive temporary shortages. They could also reinforce inequality. The people who supervised storehouses or controlled distribution held influence over the community's security. A jade object displayed status, but a full granary made that status practical. It is easier to persuade people that you occupy an important position when you have influence over what happens to several tons of dinner. Grain storage required its own system. Rice had to be properly dried before being placed in containers or buildings. Damp grain could rot. Insects and rodents had to be discouraged, which is an ambitious goal in any farming society. Storage buildings needed raised or protected floors, ventilation, maintenance, and security. Somebody also had to keep track of what entered and left. Liangzhu has not provided us with readable account books, so we do not know how quantities were recorded. Counting could have been done with baskets, containers, marks, tokens, memory, or methods that have not survived. Whatever system was used, large stores could not function through cheerful improvisation alone. Managing fields across a broad wet landscape encouraged cooperation. Water does not stop at the edge of one family's plot because someone has drawn a convincing boundary. A blocked channel upstream affects people downstream. An embankment protecting one area may direct water toward another. Maintenance therefore required discussion, shared labour, or orders from people with enough authority to settle disputes. Rice farming did not automatically create a state. Communities in many places have managed irrigation without kings, palaces, or elite cemeteries. At Liangzhu, however, farming was connected with urban construction, social hierarchy, specialised craft production, and a large regional water management system. The repeated need to organise labour gave emerging leaders opportunities to extend their authority. Those arrangements may have begun in smaller ways. Neighbours could cooperate to clear channels or repair banks. Several settlements might share access to a water source. Seasonal labour groups could work together during planting and harvest. Local leaders may have coordinated tasks, settled arguments, or arranged exchanges between communities. Over generations, the scale increased. By the time major dams and raised structures were built around Liangzhu, cooperation had moved far beyond a few related households. The hydraulic system included high dams near valley mouths, lower dams on the plain, levees, channels, and controlled waterways. Research dates its earliest major construction to about 5,100 years ago, making it one of the oldest known large-scale hydraulic systems. It is tempting to imagine a single ruler looking across the landscape one morning and announcing that several dams should be completed before lunch. The real process was probably slower and much more complicated. Builders had to understand the shape of valleys, the direction of runoff, and the properties of available soil. Materials had to be gathered and transported. Different sections used combinations of earth, grass or reed bundles, and other materials arranged to create stable constructions. Work crews needed food, tools, supervision, and places to sleep. Building may have taken place in stages, with later repairs and additions responding to changing conditions. The high dams closed gaps between hills and helped form reservoirs. Lower works regulated water nearer the plain. Long levees and raised causeways influenced the movement of water and people. The entire system could have served several purposes, including flood control, storage, irrigation, transport, and domestic supply. Archaeologists remain careful about assigning one fixed purpose to every feature because ancient infrastructure, like modern infrastructure, could do more than one job. Holding water in reservoirs gave the Liangzhu population a reserve during drier conditions. Reducing the force of runoff helped protect fields and settlements after heavy rain. Channels allowed boats to move between parts of the region. Controlled releases may have supported irrigation or maintained useful water levels in low areas. The system did not provide complete mastery over nature. No dam arrangement could remove every risk from a humid delta landscape. It made water more predictable, and predictability was valuable in a society dependent on crops that could be damaged by either excess water or shortage. Researchers have described the Liangzhu complex as one of the largest ancient efforts at hydraulic landscape engineering. The city, its rice fields, and the surrounding water system were not separate achievements. Water management protected agricultural land. Agriculture fed labourers. Labourers built and maintained the urban centre. The centre probably organised at least part of the labour and distribution. Each part strengthened the others. A successful harvest made construction possible. Construction protected or expanded production. Greater production supported more specialists and administrators. Their work allowed the central authority to take on even larger projects, which then required another successful harvest. The system was effective enough to continue for centuries, although it must also have kept a large number of people extremely busy. The landscape was being changed by farming itself. Clearing vegetation opened land for cultivation and settlement. Burning may have been used in some places to remove growth. Repeated planting altered soil structure. Ditches changed drainage. Reservoirs trapped sediment. Pollen, charcoal and microscopic plant remains preserved in the ground, show increasing human activity and pressure on local vegetation. Liangzhu's inhabitants were therefore not merely adapting to nature. They were creating a managed environment. The boundary between natural wetland and constructed landscape became less obvious. A waterway might begin as a natural stream but later be widened, redirected, bordered or connected to a ditch. A raised settlement mound might use soil taken from a newly cut channel. The channel then became a transport route serving the settlement made from the earth removed during its construction. This is a familiar human pattern. A successful field encourages expansion. Expansion requires more clearing and stronger water control. More reliable food supports a larger population. A larger population needs additional fields, homes, fuel, timber and storage. Each solution increases the scale of the next problem. Liangzhu's growth suggests that its system worked for a long time, which is a considerable achievement. It also meant that more people and more infrastructure became dependent on the same network of rivers, dams, fields, and seasonal rainfall. Settlement locations reflected that dependence. Houses and work areas were often placed on natural rises or artificial platforms above wet ground. In some areas, people built mounds before constructing buildings on top of them. Raising a settlement required moving earth, but it created firmer surfaces and reduced the risk of ordinary flooding. Channels beside these elevated zones served as transport routes and drains. Boats could approach residential areas, workshops, or storage facilities directly. From above, the Liangzhu region may have appeared as a patchwork of waterways, cultivated land, wooded areas, and raised settlements connected by narrow routes. Wood was essential. Houses, walkways, boats, tools, roofs, and structural supports depended on timber. Nearby hills and forests supplied material, but obtaining it required substantial work. Trees had to be felled with stone tools, trimmed, shaped, and transported. Large pieces of timber were much easier to move by water than across muddy ground. This connected distant parts of the economy. A building in the city might depend on wood cut near the hills, workers fed by rice from the plain, and boat crews familiar with every bend in the channels between them. Boats themselves were vital tools. We do not know exactly how every Liangzhu vessel looked, but water transport would have ranged from small craft used for fishing or short journeys to larger boats capable of carrying materials. Boat construction required suitable wood and skilled workmanship. A vessel needed to remain stable while carrying loads through shallow channels, open water, or areas with changing currents. people travelling by boat understood the region differently from people studying a modern map. They remembered routes through experience, where a channel narrowed, where reeds became dense, where water ran quickly after rain, and where a low bank could be crossed safely. The landscape was learned through movement. Clay was more local and more forgiving than timber. Potters shaped vessels for cooking, serving, storage, and ritual use. Liangzhu pottery included fine black wares as well as ordinary containers. Producing reliable pottery required suitable clay, tempering material, fuel, controlled firing, and practice. A storage jar that cracks is disappointing. A large group of storage jars that cracks is an administrative event. Specialised production helped provide vessels in the numbers needed by a growing population. Pottery also moved between settlements, carrying food and other goods along the waterways. Stone and jade connected Liangzhu to wider exchange networks. The raw materials used for prestigious objects were not equally available everywhere. Obtaining them required knowledge of distant sources and relationships with communities outside the immediate city area. Boats moving through the river system could carry valuable stone toward workshops, just as they carried food, timber, and clay. The waterways therefore supported more than survival. They allowed technical knowledge, ritual objects, people, and political influence to circulate. A jade design created near the centre could appear in a burial many kilometres away. A pottery style could spread between settlements. A visitor could carry news of a ceremony, a new leader, a damaged dam, or an unusually successful harvest. This wider network explains why Liangzhu should not be pictured as one isolated capital, surrounded by empty countryside. Sites associated with Liangzhu culture spread throughout the Taihu Basin and into neighbouring regions. They shared forms of pottery, jade, burial practice, and other material traditions, although local differences remained. Some places were large and important. Others were smaller farming settlements. A few acted as secondary centres connected with clusters of villages and fields. Goods, techniques, and symbols travelled among them. The central city held an exceptional position, but it relied on a populated region supplying food, materials, and labour. The relationship was likely unequal. Communities could provide grain, workers, timber, stone, animals, or finished goods to the centre. In return, they may have received protection, support with water management, access to trade, ritual services, or recognition within a wider political order. We cannot reconstruct the precise arrangement. There are no surviving agreements explaining how many baskets of rice were owed after harvest, or what happened when somebody insisted that heavy rain had made the calculation unfair. Burial evidence, food storage, and monumental construction nevertheless suggest that authority and resources were concentrated near the centre. The environment helped produce that authority because water management could be presented as a shared necessity. A leadership group able to organise dams and maintain channels offered a practical benefit. It could protect fields, store water, and keep transport routes open. It could also decide priorities. Which fields received protection first? Which settlement supplied repair workers? Which channel remained open? Who controlled access to stored grain? These decisions affected daily life. In a wet landscape, control over infrastructure could become control over opportunity. None of this means every ditch was designed by officials or every farming decision came from the city. Most knowledge remained local, and households still made countless choices about planting, food, animals, repairs, and exchange. Complex societies work through several levels at once. Families manage daily tasks. Neighbours cooperate. Specialists provide skills. Local leaders settle problems. Larger institutions coordinate projects beyond the capacity of one settlement. Liangzhu's importance lies partly in the evidence that these levels had become connected within a broad regional system. Daily travel would have reinforced those connections. People arriving at the central city by boat saw raised walls, platforms, controlled entrances, and large prepared areas. They passed workshops and residential zones. They may have brought rice, fish, timber, stone, or reeds, then returned with tools, pottery, ritual goods, news, or instructions. The city gathered resources and redistributed at least some of them. It also displayed the scale of the society's organisation. Even before a visitor saw elite jade, the amount of earth moved into walls and platforms made authority visible. The wetland setting influenced the shape of the city itself. Northern Chinese settlements later developed in different environments, often with greater dependence on dry farming and land routes. At Liangzhu, rivers and marshes were incorporated into the plan from the beginning. Recent research argues that water management was one of the main considerations in the planning of the ancient city. Rivers were used in the construction and organisation of walls, moats, settlements, fields, and transport routes. The difference between a defensive moat and a practical water channel was not always clear, because the same feature could help protect a settlement while also carrying water or boats. Life in this landscape required constant maintenance. Channels filled with sediment, banks eroded, wooden structures rotted, fields changed shape, dams had to be inspected after heavy rain. Paths became slippery, boats needed repair. A large engineered system is not something a society builds once and then admires from a safe distance. It continues to demand labour. Liangzhu's long period of prosperity indicates that generations kept its water system, farms and settlements functioning. Knowledge had to be passed down, workers organised, and damaged structures rebuilt even as population and land use increased. The rewards were substantial. Reliable rice production supported dense settlement. Water routes reduced the difficulty of transporting heavy goods. Reservoirs and channels provided fish and water. Raised platforms protected important spaces. Regional exchange brought materials into the city. The same environment that created risk made Liangzhu wealthy enough to support highly skilled craftspeople, elite ceremonies, and major construction. As the population grew, the natural landscape became harder to separate from the human one. Forest gave way to fields and managed woodland. Swamps became channels, paddies, reservoirs, or raised ground. Rivers were redirected or bordered by embankments. Sediment settled behind dams. The Liangzhu people were living in a world partly inherited and partly built. A rainfall event met not only soil and vegetation, but also walls, ditches, fields, storehouses, and political decisions. From ground level, the great city may not have appeared suddenly. A traveller approaching through the waterways would first pass cultivated land and smaller settlements. Raised mounds would become more frequent. Boats would carry larger loads. Channels would lead toward more heavily constructed areas. Then the scale would change. Broad earthen structures rose above the plain. Platforms supported buildings whose timber frames and roofs could be seen from a distance. Work areas, storage zones, and residences occupied ground that had been deliberately prepared. For modern archaeologists, much of that world remained difficult to recognise because its most important architecture was made from earth. A stone wall announces itself even after centuries. An earthen wall can look like a natural rise, a field boundary, or simply an inconvenient place to dig. Water deposits new layers, vegetation covers old surfaces, farming smooths the ground, rivers change course. The same landscape that supported Liangzhu also helped conceal it. That is why the discovery of the ancient city required researchers to read the terrain with unusual care. Differences in soil, lines of stone beneath the surface, buried channels and raised sections that did not match natural formations began to reveal a deliberate plan. What appeared to be separate mounds and ordinary fields turned out to belong to something much larger. Beneath the modern ground lay walls, gates, platforms, waterways, and traces of a city whose builders had spent centuries learning how to make a wet plain support an urban centre. For centuries, the remains of Liangzhu sat beneath farmland, roads, villages, and layers of river sediment. People lived above the old city without seeing its walls. Farmers worked soil that had once been carried into place by ancient labourers. Houses stood near buried platforms. Water flowed through channels that followed routes used thousands of years earlier. The city had not vanished in one dramatic event. Most of it had simply become difficult to distinguish from the landscape around it. This is one reason the discovery of Liangzhu took so long. Its builders did not rely on enormous blocks of cut stone. They constructed walls, terraces, roads, and building foundations mainly with earth, clay, timber, and smaller stones. Wood decayed, roofs collapsed, earthen walls settled and eroded. Later floods covered old surfaces, while farming gradually levelled the ground. After several thousand years, the remains of a city wall could look like nothing more impressive than a slightly raised strip of land where crops grew differently. Archaeology in China was still a young discipline when the first Liangzhu remains attracted serious attention. During the early 20th century, researchers were beginning to apply systematic excavation methods to prehistoric sites. They were learning how to use pottery styles, buried soil layers, tools, graves, and building traces to reconstruct periods that had left no readable historical records. There was still much uncertainty about how the different prehistoric cultures of China were related, especially outside the better-studied regions of the Yellow River. In 1936, a young researcher named Xingeng was working at the Westlake Museum in Hangzhou. He had grown up in the area around Liangzhu and became interested in reports of old pottery appearing in the fields. During surveys and excavations near Liangzhu town, he uncovered polished black pottery and other Neolithic remains. The objects did not belong to any known historical dynasty, and their style suggested that they came from a previously unrecognized prehistoric culture. Later research would trace the formal beginning of Liangzhu archaeology to this work. She was not standing at the edge of a visible ruined capital. There were no towers, gateways, or palace walls rising above the ground. He was dealing with fragments. Pottery appeared in pits and soil layers. Stone tools showed that people had once lived and worked there. Different sites were scattered across the surrounding area, but their relationship was unclear. The most reasonable interpretation at the time was that these were the remains of prehistoric settlements, not parts of a single organised urban centre. Black pottery was especially important because archaeologists used changes in pottery form and production to distinguish one ancient culture from another. A broken vessel may seem less exciting than a gold mask or a royal tomb, but pottery is one of archaeology's most dependable sources of information. People use it for cooking, serving, storage, transport, and ritual. It breaks frequently, which is unfortunate for the original owner but helpful for later researchers. Once a pot is broken, nobody usually carries every fragment very far, so pieces often remain close to where they were used. The problem was that black pottery had also been found at sites in northern China associated with the Longshan culture. Some early researchers therefore tried to place the material from the lower Yangtze within categories already created for the north. Similar colour did not necessarily mean the same society, but archaeological classification was still developing. It took years of comparison before scholars could show that the pottery, tools, settlement patterns, and jade traditions of the Lake Tai region belonged to a distinct cultural system. In 1959, the archaeologist Xia Nai formally proposed the name Liangzhu culture. The name came from the modern place where Xingeng had conducted his early work. It did not tell researchers what the ancient inhabitants called themselves. No inscription has been found saying in effect, "Welcome to Liangzhu, please keep the waterways clear." The archaeological name was a practical label that allowed scholars to group related sites and objects found across the lower Yangtze region. For the next several decades, researchers continued to excavate individual settlements and cemeteries. Each site added information, but the wider pattern remained incomplete. Archaeologists could identify Liangzhu pottery and stone tools. They knew that the culture had produced unusually refined jade objects. They could see that it had spread across a large area around Lake Tai. What they could not yet see was the political centre that connected many of these discoveries. The evidence changed sharply in the 1980s. In 1986, archaeologists excavated Fanshan, a raised location west of what would later be recognized as the center of the ancient city. 11 large tombs were uncovered within a carefully arranged cemetery. 9 were well preserved, and the burials contained more than 1,200 objects or sets of objects made from jade, stone, ivory, and lacquered materials. More than 90% of the surviving grave goods were jade. The quantity was impressive, but the quality and arrangement mattered just as much. These were not ordinary graves belonging to people who had happened to collect a few attractive stones. Large Cong tubes, bai discs, ceremonial axes, ornaments, and other objects had been placed with the dead according to repeated patterns. Some objects required exceptional skill and long periods of work. The people buried at Fanshan had access to specialist craftspeople, valuable raw materials, and a large amount of labour. Nothing in the cemetery revealed the names of the dead. Archaeologists could not read a title, family history, or account of their achievements. Their position had to be inferred from the scale of the tombs, their location, and the grave goods placed around them. The evidence suggested that these individuals belonged to the highest level of Liangzhu society. Fanshan is commonly described as a royal or elite cemetery, although the precise political title used by Liangzhu people remains unknown. A nearby discovery at Yaoshan added another important piece. Excavations revealed an altar-like construction combined with high-status burials containing hundreds of jade objects. The repeated relationship between ceremonial spaces, carefully organised graves, and prestigious jades suggested that Liangzhu authority had a strong ritual component. Important people did not merely possess more goods. Their burials connected them with shared symbols and formal ceremonies that were recognised across the wider culture. Archaeologists were now looking at something more complicated than a collection of equal farming villages. Social divisions were clear, skilled production was concentrated. Certain sites had special ceremonial functions. Yet the location from which this society had been directed was still not obvious. The richest graves pointed toward the Liangzhu area, but a cemetery is not a city. Researchers needed evidence of large-scale planning, monumental construction, and a permanent central settlement. That evidence began to emerge at Mojiaoshan. Excavation during the early 1990s showed that what had appeared to be a large natural mound was actually an enormous artificial platform. People had built it by carrying and packing repeated layers of different soils. The completed terrace covered roughly 300,000 square metres and stood above the surrounding wetland. Traces of large buildings were found on its surface, along with broad open areas. Researchers began to interpret Mojiaoshan as a palace or administrative zone occupied by the society's highest-ranking group. The word palace can create a misleading image. There were no stone columns, tiled halls, or painted imperial roofs of the kind associated with much later Chinese architecture. Liangzhu buildings were constructed mainly from timber, earth, reeds, and other organic materials. Their upper structures have disappeared. What survives are post holes, foundation trenches, prepared floors, burnt deposits, and the artificial ground on which the building stood. Those traces can still reveal scale. Some of the building foundations on Mojiaoshan were much larger than ordinary houses. They were arranged within an area that had been deliberately planned and levelled. Constructing the platform required moving a huge quantity of soil before a single major building could be raised. That effort only makes sense if the location had a special purpose, and if an authority could organise workers from beyond one household or small neighbourhood. Fanshan stood close to this platform. The most prestigious known cemetery was therefore beside the most impressive known construction. This was unlikely to be an accident. Political leadership, ritual activity, and elite burial appear to have been concentrated in the same part of the landscape. Mojiaoshan and Fanshan together suggested that archaeologists had found the centre of Liangzhu power, but the boundaries of that centre were still hidden. From 1997 to 2002, a large survey examined the wider Liangzhu site group. Researchers identified 135 archaeological sites distributed across the area. The results showed that the ancient centre was surrounded by a dense network of settlements, cemeteries, work areas, and raised platforms. Instead of studying one isolated mound at a time, archaeologists could begin to examine how the sites formed a connected system. Surveying a wet and heavily used landscape is not simple. Ancient remains may sit beneath modern villages, roads, ponds, and cultivated fields. Archaeologists cannot dig up an entire region to see what is underneath, especially when people are currently living and working there. They use smaller excavations, surface finds, soil cores, test trenches, old maps, aerial photographs, and geophysical measurements. Each method gives a limited view, and those views have to be combined. Soil coring is particularly useful at a site like Liangzhu. A narrow sample taken from the ground can show changes in soil composition several meters below the surface. Natural wetland deposits look different from deliberately packed earth. A layer of stones beneath a thick band of compacted clay may indicate construction. Repeating the process at regular intervals allows archaeologists to follow a buried feature without opening one continuous trench through farmland and someone's vegetable patch. By the early 2000s, Mojiaoshan was recognized as a major central platform, and the surrounding site cluster was understood to be unusually dense. Still, the existence of a walled city had not been confirmed. Researchers knew where the likely centre was. They did not know whether it had been enclosed, how large the enclosure might have been, or whether the separate raised areas belonged to one planned urban layout. The breakthrough began near Putaofan, a low area about 200 metres west of Mojiaoshan. Archaeological work there in 2006 exposed an unusual construction. Beneath the soil was a broad spread of stones covered by thick layers of deliberately placed earth. At first, the feature was difficult to interpret. In a region filled with ancient water control works, a large earthen construction might be a dam, embankment, causeway, or settlement platform. The excavators followed it. Additional trenches and cores showed that the feature continued north and south. Its position beside the known central area suggested another possibility. Rather than a dam crossing a watercourse, it might be the western wall of an enclosure. That possibility required careful testing. One broad line of packed earth does not prove the existence of a city. Archaeologists had to search for matching constructions on the other sides of Mojiaoshan. If the western feature was part of a wall, there should be northern, eastern and southern sections forming a recognisable boundary. There might also be breaks for gates, channels beside the wall, and differences between deposits inside and outside the enclosure. Investigations continued through 2007. One by one, traces of all four sides were identified and confirmed. The buried constructions formed a rounded rectangular enclosure around Mojiaoshan and other important sites. The perimeter measured about 6 kilometres. Much of the wall was 40 to 60 metres wide, although dimensions varied. It was built with a foundation of stones and layers of packed earth and clay. What had looked like separate rises in the landscape were parts of a single enormous structure. The confirmation changed the interpretation of everything inside. Mojiaoshan was no longer simply a large ritual platform surrounded by scattered settlements. It stood near the middle of a planned inner city covering about 3 square kilometres. Fanshan was not merely a wealthy cemetery somewhere nearby. It occupied a privileged location within the same enclosed centre. Waterways, workshops, residential terraces and gates could now be studied as parts of one urban system. On November 29, 2007, the discovery of Liangzhu ancient city was publicly announced. More than 70 years had passed since Xixingyang first excavated black pottery in the area. The city had been there throughout that entire period, but recognizing it required several generations of excavation, survey and comparison. The walls themselves were unlike the narrow stone barriers many people picture when they hear the word city wall. Their width was substantial because they were broad earthen constructions, probably serving several functions. They marked the edge of the central settlement and controlled movement into it. They may have offered protection from conflict, but they could also have helped manage flooding, and provided raised ground suitable for activity or habitation. Researchers found evidence of occupation along parts of the wall. This suggests that it was not simply an empty defensive barrier. People may have lived or worked on raised areas near it. In a wet landscape, the wall created dry space as well as separation. A person standing on top would have been elevated above nearby marshland and channels, with a clearer view of boats and people approaching the city. 9 entrances have been identified in the inner wall system, 8 water gates and 1 land gate. The only known land entrance stood in the southern wall and included several passageways. Most movement into and out of the city appears to have taken place by water, which fits the wider environment. A visitor was more likely to arrive by boat than along a broad, dry road. The 8 water gates were not decorative openings. They allowed rivers and controlled channels to cross the wall. Boats could pass between the city's internal network and the waterways beyond. Water also had to keep moving through the site. Completely sealing a large wetland settlement inside an earthen barrier would have created a very impressive pond, which was probably not the objective. The city contained more than 50 ancient river courses, while inner and outer moats added further channels around the walls. Several major waterways passed near Mojiaoshan, linking the centre with workshops, residential areas, and external routes. Timber piles were used in some places to strengthen riverbanks. The result was a city organised as much around boats and channels as around paths and dry ground. The walls also made the social layout easier to understand. Mojiaoshan occupied the most prominent central position. High-status burials lay nearby. Residential and craft areas were arranged around them. The farther one moved from the centre, the more the scale and apparent status of construction changed. This did not mean that every important person lived at an exact measured distance from Mojiaoshan, but the overall pattern suggests deliberate zoning. The central platform was built high above the original marshy surface. Other artificial terraces were distributed throughout the enclosed area. More than 20 have been identified inside the inner city. Houses and workplaces stood on these raised zones, while waterways ran between them. The city therefore did not consist of continuous dry streets bordered by buildings. It was a collection of constructed islands, platforms, banks, and walls joined by water and narrow land routes. At Zhongjiagang, archaeologists found evidence of residences, workshops, and ancient riverbanks. Craft production appears to have been organised in particular areas rather than scattered evenly through the settlement. Stone and jade working, woodworking, pottery production, lacquer work, and other activities required raw materials and skilled labour. Locating workshops near waterways made it easier to bring in heavy supplies and carry finished goods away. Excavation near the eastern slope of Mojiaoshan also found a large deposit of carbonised rice. The Liangzhu Site Authority reports an estimated surviving quantity of about 13,000 kilograms. Researchers have suggested that the grain may have been associated with storage near the palace area and later dumped after a fire. The exact event cannot be reconstructed with certainty, but the concentration confirms that large amounts of rice were being brought toward the central zone. The city walls strengthened the interpretation of Liangzhu as an early state because they represented planned construction on a scale far beyond ordinary household work. The stone bedding used beneath the walls covered an estimated area of roughly 290,000 square metres. Stone had to be collected from surrounding hills, shaped or selected, loaded onto boats or rafts, transported to the site, unloaded and arranged. Earth then had to be brought in and compacted above it. The wall was not built with one convenient pile of material found beside every section. Different soils and stones came from different locations. Workers needed tools for digging and carrying, boats needed crews. Food had to be supplied throughout the work. Supervisors had to decide where each layer went and how the wall would connect with natural hills, rivers and gates. Liangzhu's planners incorporated 2 natural elevations, Jishan in the northeast and Fengshan in the southwest, into the enclosure. This reduced some of the construction required and used the existing terrain to strengthen the plan. The rest of the boundary joined these higher points with artificial walls, It was a practical decision, but it also shows that the builders understood the region at a large scale before construction began. Building the city would have taken years, perhaps through several stages. The walls needed maintenance after rain and flooding. Gates had to remain open and stable. Riverbanks required repair. Platforms were enlarged or resurfaced. Buildings were replaced as wooden posts decayed. The city was not a completed object that remained unchanged for 1,000 years. It was rebuilt continually by the people who used it. After the inner wall was recognized, research moved farther outward. Archaeologists surveyed more than 10 square kilometers around the city and initially confirmed an outer city in 2010. Instead of one enclosure surrounded immediately by farms, Liangzhu had a broader ring of raised settlements and constructed areas beyond the inner wall. The total urban system covered roughly 6.3 square kilometers, although the exact boundaries and functions of different outer zones continue to be studied. This produced a 3-level pattern: the raised palace zone at the center, the enclosed inner city around it, and the more extensive outer city beyond. Such an arrangement made social differences visible in space. The most restricted and monumental location was placed at the center. Other populations lived and worked around it. The walls and waterways controlled access between these zones. A wall is never only a piece of construction. It tells people that one side is different from the other. It decides where movement is easy and where it is difficult. It allows those controlling the gates to observe what enters and leaves. At Liangzhu, the walls may have separated elite spaces from ordinary ones, protected valuable stores and workshops, managed water, and marked the authority of the central leadership. The city's scale also changed estimates of its population. The Liangzhu Site Authority has suggested that the combined residential space of the inner and outer urban system could have supported around 30,000 people. Population estimates for prehistoric cities are always approximate because archaeologists must work from settlement area, building density, food supply, and incomplete excavation. Even a lower figure would still represent a large concentration for the period. Not everyone inside the urban zone would have been an administrator, priest, or jade master. Most residents performed ordinary work. They repaired boats, carried earth, prepared food, made tools, cleaned channels, watched children, processed rice, tended animals, and maintained houses. The difference was that their work took place within a centre whose scale and organisation were unusual for Neolithic East Asia. Modern technology has helped researchers investigate the city without excavating every feature. Electrical resistivity surveys can detect differences between packed construction material and wetter surrounding soil. Magnetometer readings can reveal areas disturbed by human activity. Drilling confirms whether a geophysical pattern corresponds to a wall, gate, river course, or cultural deposit. At Liangzhu, such methods have helped trace buried walls and identify breaks that may represent entrances. These techniques are valuable because excavation is destructive. Once archaeologists remove a soil layer, it cannot be put back in its original condition. Every trench must therefore answer a clear question and be recorded in detail. Photographs, drawings, 3-dimensional measurements, samples, and written descriptions preserve what was removed. Much of Liangzhu remains unexcavated so that future researchers can examine it with methods that may not yet exist. Preservation presents a difficult balance. The site lies close to a large modern city in a region with active development, agriculture, roads, and tourism. Protecting the buried remains requires monitoring water levels, controlling construction, limiting excavation, and explaining why an apparently empty field may contain part of a major ancient capital. UNESCO inscribed the archaeological ruins of Liangzhu City on the World Heritage List in 2019, recognizing the city, cemeteries, hydraulic works, and surrounding environment as parts of one connected property. Visitors today should not expect to walk through rows of intact 5,000-year-old houses. The site park uses low reconstructions, signs, vegetation, raised viewing areas, models, and digital displays to show where walls, platforms, gates, and waterways once stood. the most important remains often stay protected under soil. This can be less immediately dramatic than a standing stone temple, but it is safer for the archaeology. The buried condition also preserves information that exposure might destroy. Waterlogged soil can protect wood, seeds, plant fibres, and other organic remains when oxygen is limited. Once these materials are uncovered, they may begin to dry, crack, or decay. Archaeologists and conservators must decide whether an object should be removed, treated, displayed, reburied, or left untouched. The discovery of the walls did more than add another ancient city to a map. It changed how the entire Liangzhu cultural area was interpreted. The fine jades were no longer isolated masterpieces made by talented village craftspeople. They belonged to a society centred on a planned capital. The elite tombs were part of a formal urban core. The rice stores supported a concentrated population and leadership group. The surrounding settlements supplied labour and resources to an enclosed centre. Most importantly, the city proved that large-scale urban development in ancient China was not confined to the northern plains. More than 5,000 years ago, people in the lower Yangtze had built a form of city suited to wetlands. It relied on packed earth rather than cut stone architecture, boats rather than broad roads, and raised platforms rather than a continuous dry surface. Its difference from later cities was not evidence that it was less organised. It showed that urban planning could take a different form when water controlled so much of daily life. A final question remained once the walls had been traced. The city was too large, too carefully positioned, and too closely tied to its waterways to be understood on its own. Its builders had raised platforms above marshland and opened gates through the walls for rivers. They had brought food and construction material toward the centre by boat. Yet the channels inside the city represented only a small part of the hydraulic landscape. Beyond the outer settlements, across the plains and near the mouths of valleys, archaeologists were beginning to recognise other broad earthen features. Some had been known as hills or embankments, others were barely visible. Once the city's boundaries became clear, researchers could ask whether these distant constructions belonged to the same plan. The search moved upstream, where a much larger system of dams had been waiting beneath the ground. The search that began at the buried walls did not stop at the edge of the city. Archaeologists followed the old waterways toward the hills northwest of Liangzhu, where streams descended from the Tianmu Mountains and entered the flat, heavily settled plain. The land there looked natural at first. Low ridges crossed the fields, valleys narrowed between isolated hills, long banks ran along the foot of the mountains. Some had been altered by roads, farming and modern construction. Others blended so well into the terrain that there was little reason to suspect they had been built by people. That appearance was misleading. Beneath the vegetation and accumulated soil were the remains of a large water management system. It included dams placed across valley mouths, lower barriers joining hills on the plain, a long embankment running in front of the mountains, reservoirs, spillways, channels, ditches, moats, and natural rivers incorporated into the same network. The recognised core system covered a wide area northwest of the city and consisted of 11 major artificial dams arranged in several groups. Together, these works helped control water before it reached the urban centre and the rice fields around it. The first clues had appeared long before archaeologists understood the complete arrangement. In the late 1980s, researchers began investigating broad earthen features outside the ancient city. One high dam, located about 11 kilometres northwest of the urban centre, was exposed during road construction before the year 2000. Another became visible after road damage in 2009. These discoveries encouraged archaeologists to examine nearby valleys, where they found more barriers occupying similar positions between hills. The difficulty was proving that the features were artificial. A low ridge between two hills can form naturally. Floods deposit sediment. Landslides block valleys. Farmers build banks and terraces. Modern roads can cover older structures. Archaeologists needed to examine the internal layers, compare the shapes of different sites, and determine whether the same construction methods appeared repeatedly. They used excavation, boreholes, topographic surveys, hydrological modelling, aerial photographs and satellite imagery. A declassified corona satellite image from 1969 proved especially useful in identifying the low dam reservoir zone. The image had been taken before much of the recent development that altered the region. From above, lines that were difficult to recognise at ground level became easier to follow across fields and settlements. Later investigations showed that the high dams, low dams and long embankments were connected parts of one hydraulic system rather than unrelated local constructions. The high dams stood farthest upstream, at narrow openings where valleys emerge from the hills. 6 have been identified in the classic Liangzhu system, divided into eastern and western groups. Each group used several dams and the surrounding natural hills to hold water within the valleys. Instead of building one enormous barrier across an open plain, the Liangzhu engineers selected narrow gaps and allowed the hills to form most of the reservoir boundary. This reduced the amount of construction material required, although reduced does not mean small. Individual high dams were generally between about 100 and 200 metres long. Some were around 80 to 100 metres wide at the base. Their crests stood roughly 30 to 40 metres above sea level, depending on the group and surrounding terrain. Natural low points beside the dams could serve as spillways, allowing excess water to escape before it rose high enough to damage the main structure. The high dams created reservoirs in the valleys behind them. During periods of heavy rain, these reservoirs could slow the water descending toward the plain. Without the dams, runoff from the hills would gather speed in narrow valleys and then spread across lower ground, threatening settlements and fields. By holding back part of that flow, the system reduced the force and timing of floods reaching the city. The reservoirs were also useful during drier periods. Water stored after rainfall could remain available for transport, farming and daily use. The builders were not simply trying to keep water away, they were trying to change when and where it arrived. That distinction was central to Liangzhu's survival. Too much water at once could destroy crops. Too little water over several weeks could also damage them. The most useful water was water that could be delayed, stored, redirected or released gradually. Farther downstream stood the low dams. 4 major examples have been identified in the core system. These barriers connected isolated hills and raised ground on the plain, creating another reservoir area close to the city. The low dams were generally smaller in height than the upstream barriers, but they controlled water across a wider, flatter landscape. Together with the high dams, they formed 2 levels of protection. Water coming from the mountains first met the high reservoirs. Flow that continued downstream then entered the lower storage zone. This arrangement reduced pressure on any one barrier. It also gave the system more flexibility. Heavy rain in one valley could be held upstream, while the lower reservoir managed water already moving across the plain. If everything had depended on one large dam, a failure would have been much more serious, and ancient engineers were no more fond of placing all their hopes behind one wall than modern ones. A third major feature ran east to west along the foot of Dazhe Mountain. It is often called the Tangshan Levee, or the causeway in front of the mountains. It extended for at least 5 kilometers and varied from roughly 20 to 50 meters in width and 2 to 7 meters in height. Some sections consisted of a single raised bank. In the central area, 2 parallel embankments formed a long enclosed channel or ditch-like structure. The Tangshan construction may have served several purposes. It could hold or redirect water, create a raised route across wet ground, connect different parts of the hydraulic system, and support movement along the mountain front. The channel between parallel banks may have stored water before it was released toward distribution outlets. Later workshops and elite burials were built on top of parts of the levee, showing that the structure had become stable, an important ground within the Liangzhu landscape. Calling the Tangshan feature a levee, dam, or causeway can make it sound as though it had one clearly defined job. Ancient infrastructure was often less specialised. The same bank could influence flood water, provide a dry route, support buildings, guide boats through an adjacent channel, and mark the edge of a managed area. Its function may also have changed as the city expanded. The methods used to build the dams were well suited to wet ground. At sites such as Laohuling and Liushan, excavations revealed bundles of clay wrapped in grass or reed-like plant material. These packages were laid in alternating directions, with additional layers of yellow clay packed above and around them. The bundles acted rather like sandbags, helping the damp clay hold together and reducing the chance that it would spread or wash away before the structure became stable. The idea was simple enough to understand, but applying it on the scale of a dam required careful work. Clay had to be dug from suitable deposits. Grass or reeds had to be cut and gathered. Workers wrapped portions of clay, carried them to the construction site, placed them in ordered layers, and packed more earth over them. The process was repeated thousands of times. Different soils behaved differently when wet. Some clay held together well but was difficult to move. Other material drained quickly but did not form a strong barrier. Builders needed to know which earth belonged in the core, which could form the outer slopes, and how the dam would settle after construction. They may not have described these properties using modern engineering vocabulary, but practical experience can be very precise even when it is not written as a formula. The workers also had to prepare the swampy ground beneath the low dams. Excavations found pale clay layers produced by long-term waterlogging. Building directly on such a surface risked movement and uneven settling. The wrapped clay bundles created a more controlled foundation before the main body was raised. The technique suggests that Liangzhu builders had learned from earlier attempts, local observation, or repeated repairs. A dam does not need to look elegant inside. It needs to stay where it was placed. Ancient labourers were not trying to create a smooth museum exhibit for visitors 5,000 years later. They were trying to keep a great quantity of wet soil from returning to its previous location. The survival of parts of these structures shows that their methods were effective. Radiocarbon dating provided the evidence needed to connect the hydraulic works with the Liangzhu society. Archaeologists sampled short-lived grasses used in the clay bundles and charcoal buried inside the dams. Because annual plants had grown shortly before they were incorporated into the structures, they gave relatively direct dates for construction. Most dates from the high dams fall between about 5,200 and 4,800 years ago. Dates from the low dams and the Tangshan levee cluster, mainly between about 5,000 and 4,800 years ago. The sequence suggests that some upstream barriers were built first, followed by the lower dams and long levees. Much of the hydraulic system therefore existed before or during the early construction of the main city. This order is important. The dams were not a late addition built after Liangzhu had already become a large capital. Water management helped create the conditions in which the city could grow. Reservoirs and controlled channels supported transport, farming, building, and settlement. The urban centre and hydraulic system developed together, but the earliest dams appear to have prepared the landscape before much of the enclosed city reached its final scale. Researchers have estimated that the major dams required the movement of roughly 2.88 million cubic metres of earth. One modelling exercise suggested that about 3,000 people working for 8 years could have completed the work. This is an estimate rather than a surviving Liangzhu employment record, but it gives some sense of the labour involved. The calculation assumes organised crews, regular working periods, and methods for moving earth in baskets, containers, or boats. The real workforce may have been larger or smaller. Construction may have stopped during planting and harvest. Different communities may have been assigned to different dams. Some workers may have served for short periods, while skilled supervisors remained for longer. Whatever the exact arrangement, the project required coordination over several years. Workers had to arrive where they were needed. Materials had to be prepared before construction. Food had to be supplied to people labouring away from their own fields. Tools had to be replaced. Decisions had to be made when rain interrupted the schedule or a section settled badly. This was more than a technical achievement. It was an organisational one. A society can know how to build a dam and still fail to build it if nobody can coordinate the labour. Liangzhu possessed institutions capable of directing people and resources across a broad region. Those institutions may have involved religious authority, political leadership, obligations between settlements, or several forms of control operating together. The work may not always have been voluntary. Monumental construction is often presented as evidence that people shared a common goal, and many Liangzhu inhabitants certainly benefited from flood protection and water storage. That does not tell us how labour was collected. Families may have owed a certain number of working days. Villages may have been required to provide crews. Leaders may have used stored rice to feed workers, while ritual ceremonies helped present the project as a duty to the wider community. There was probably no single moment when everyone agreed that they were now building an early state. People would have experienced the system through practical demands. A messenger arrived. A work group was needed. A bank required repair. A household contributed rice. A local leader passed on instructions from someone higher in the hierarchy. Over time, these repeated obligations connected distant settlements to the centre. The dams also depended on people who understood water. Someone had to choose the valley gaps. Someone had to recognise natural spillways and decide the safe height of a barrier. Builders needed to estimate how far a reservoir might extend. They had to understand that blocking one stream could redirect water into another area. Mistakes would not remain theoretical for long. This knowledge probably came from generations of farming and settlement in the region. The Liangzhu people had watched floods fill low ground and streams cut new channels. They knew which hills remained above water after heavy rain. They had repaired smaller banks around fields and settlements. The large hydraulic system expanded familiar techniques rather than appearing from nowhere. Monitoring continued after construction. Reservoir levels changed with the seasons. Grass and trees grew on the dams. Burrowing animals weakened banks. Water found small cracks and enlarged them. Sediment accumulated behind barriers. Spillways became blocked. A dam that was ignored for several years could become less reliable. Even if it had been built well, maintenance crews may have inspected the structures before the wet season. Weak sections could be reinforced with fresh clay bundles. Channels were cleared. Banks were raised where repeated flooding had worn them down. These tasks were less impressive than the original construction, but they were what kept the system working. The hydraulic network also made transport more dependable. The Liangzhu city contained many canals, ditches, moats, and natural channels. One study estimated that the artificial waterways inside and around the urban centre totaled about 30 kilometres. By adjusting water levels upstream, the reservoir system may have helped keep some channels deep enough for boats during drier periods. This was important because the city depended on moving heavy materials. Stone for walls came from hills. Timber came from forested areas. Rice arrived from fields across the plain. Jade raw material and other valuable goods travelled through regional exchange networks. Carrying these loads over muddy ground would have required far more effort than floating them along a channel. A loaded boat still needed suitable water depth. If levels fell too low, it grounded. If current became too fast, navigation was dangerous. If channels filled with sediment, crews had to clear them or find another route. Reservoirs and controlled releases could reduce these problems, although archaeologists cannot reconstruct every daily operating decision. Irrigation was probably another benefit, but it should not be treated as the only reason for the dams. The system was much larger than a set of field ditches. Stored water could support rice cultivation during dry conditions, while lower dams and channels helped distribute or drain water across the plain. At the same time, flood control and transport may have been equally important. Archaeological studies generally describe the network as multifunctional, serving flood management, water storage, transport, irrigation, and domestic supply. The system's size also created risks. Water stored behind a dam is useful because it has been concentrated. That concentration becomes dangerous if the barrier fails. A breach in an upstream reservoir could send a sudden surge into the lower system. The builders therefore relied on wide earthworks, natural hills, carefully prepared foundations, and spillways that released excess water away from the main dam body. Natural spillways were an efficient choice. Instead of constructing complex gates from materials that could rot or jam, engineers used low rocky passes beside some dams. Once water reached a certain level, it could flow through the pass without overtopping the earthen barrier. This limited the maximum reservoir height and reduced pressure during extreme rainfall. The arrangement required accurate knowledge of elevation. A spillway only works as intended when it is lower than the vulnerable crest, but high enough to retain useful water. The difference could be small. At some high dam groups, the natural outlet lay only around a metre below the dam crest. Liangzhu surveyors did not possess modern laser levels, but they could compare heights using water, sight lines, poles, cords, and repeated observation. The reservoirs changed the local environment. Valleys that had once carried seasonal streams now held larger bodies of water. Sediment settled behind the dams. Fish and wetland plants occupied new areas. Paths and boat routes shifted. Communities may have settled near the reservoirs to fish, monitor the structures, or manage transport. Stored water also gave the central authority a resource that could be controlled. Decisions about release affected downstream farmers and boat traffic. Maintenance required labour from surrounding settlements. Access to the most dependable routes may have depended on cooperation with the people managing the system. This did not mean that officials stood beside every outlet with a 5,000-year-old clipboard. Control could be exercised through local leaders and customary obligations. A village near one dam might be responsible for routine repairs. Another supplied grass bundles. A third provided food during construction. Larger decisions may have come from the elite centre at Liangzhu. The physical layout encouraged this connection. The reservoir stood upstream. The long causeway linked the mountain front. Low dams controlled water near the plain. Channels then carried water and boats toward the city. The system directed movement toward the same centre that contained the Great Mujushan platform, elite burials, workshops, and rice stores. Infrastructure made political power visible without requiring written proclamations. A family living downstream could see that fields remained usable after heavy rain because water had been slowed in the hills. A boat crew could travel through maintained channels. Farmers could draw on stored water when rainfall was low. The benefits were practical, and practical benefits can make authority easier to accept. They can also make people dependent. Once fields, settlements, and transport routes were built around a managed hydraulic network, abandoning that network became difficult. If maintenance stopped, channels filled, and banks failed. If the leadership weakened, local communities might struggle to coordinate repairs across the entire system. Large infrastructure can strengthen a society while it works and expose it when coordination breaks down. The traditional core of 11 dams remains the best-known part of Liangzhu's peripheral hydraulic system. More recent remote sensing and field research has suggested that water engineering in the wider region was even more extensive. A study published in 2025 reported that archaeologists had confirmed 132 ancient dam sites around and beyond Liangzhu by 2024. Using historical aerial and satellite images together with hydrological analysis and field verification. These additional sites do not all necessarily belong to one project or one exact date, and research into their chronology and relationships continues. They show that the broader landscape may have contained many more local water control works than the original map revealed. Many are hard to find because 5,000 years of erosion, flooding, agriculture, road building and urban growth have altered them. Some dams visible on photographs from the 1940s through the 1970s have since been damaged or covered by development. Researchers are now testing machine learning systems to search old images for the curved, rectangular or saddle-shaped forms associated with known dams. The results still require archaeological confirmation, because a field, house platform and damaged dam can look annoyingly similar from above. The use of satellites to locate Neolithic earthworks is a useful reminder of how the Liangzhu story has developed. The builders worked without writing, steel tools, engines, or modern surveying equipment. The archaeologists studying them now use radiocarbon dating, geographic information systems, hydrological models, remote sensing, and artificial intelligence. One group shaped the landscape. The other is trying to recognize the shape before modern activity removes it. Liangzhu's hydraulic system is among the oldest known examples of large-scale formalized water management. Its age places it beside the early engineering traditions of other ancient urban societies, but the comparison should not turn into a competition over which civilization moved wet soil first. The more useful point is that complex water engineering appeared in the lower Yangtze at a very early stage, before China's historically recorded dynasties. The form of the system was suited to its setting. Mesopotamian communities often concentrated on canals that carried river water through dry land. Liangzhu faced a different problem. Rainfall, mountain runoff, wetlands and rice fields created a landscape where excess water could be as threatening as shortage. Its solution combined storage, flood reduction, transport and distribution across several levels. The dams did not tame water in the sense of making it harmless. They reduced uncertainty. A severe storm could still exceed the system's capacity. A prolonged wet period could saturate the plain. A damaged embankment could redirect flow toward a settlement. The people of Liangzhu remained dependent on rainfall patterns they could not control. Their achievement was to make those patterns more manageable for many generations. The reservoirs supported a growing city. The channels carried materials. The protected plains produced rice. Stored grain fed specialists and labourers. The same coordinated system that raised walls and platforms also built dams in distant valleys. Such projects tell us a great deal about Liangzhu power, but they do not explain how that power was understood. Labour can be organised through force, exchange, family obligation, religious duty, or a mixture of all four. A dam protects fields, yet it does not by itself explain why one family was buried with hundreds of jade objects, while another received almost nothing. For that, we have to return from the valley mouths to the people who controlled the centre. Their authority was expressed not only through walls, reservoirs and stored rice, but through objects placed on bodies, displayed in ceremonies, and buried in carefully prepared graves. These objects were made from jade, worked slowly into forms that appeared across the Liangzhu world and carried meanings the dams alone could never provide. The dams show that Liangzhu's leaders could organize thousands of people, move enormous amounts of earth, and reshape water across a wide region. Yet engineering alone cannot explain why those leaders were obeyed, how their authority was displayed, or why a small group received such different treatment from everyone else. For those questions, the strongest evidence comes from jade. Thousands of Liangzhu jade objects have been recovered from graves across the lower Yangtze region. Some are small ornaments that could be worn on the body, others are heavy discs, tubes, blades, and ceremonial axes that would have been inconvenient for ordinary use. The richest collections come from a limited number of elite cemeteries, especially Fanshan and Yoshan near the centre of Liangzhu power. Their concentration in important burials connects jade with rank, ritual, and political authority rather than simple personal decoration. Jade was not valuable because it was easy to work. It was valuable partly because it was so difficult. Much of the material used by Liangzhu craftspeople was nephrite, a tough stone made from tightly interlocking mineral fibres. It can survive heavy impact without breaking as easily as many harder but more brittle stones. That quality makes a finished object durable, but it also makes the production process extremely slow. A craftsperson could not take a metal knife and carve nephrite as though it were a piece of wood. The basic shape had to be created by sawing, grinding, drilling and polishing with abrasive minerals. On unfinished objects, researchers can sometimes see the marks left by these processes. Fine sand containing hard minerals was placed between the jade and a tool, then moved repeatedly across the surface. The abrasive did the cutting. The saw, cord, drill or grinding stone mainly kept it moving in the correct place. To make a jade disc, a worker first needed a suitable piece of raw stone. A slab might be separated from a larger block using repeated sawing with abrasive material. The outside edge was then shaped and ground. A hollow drill could be used from both sides to form the central opening. If the two drilled sections failed to meet exactly, a small ridge remained inside the hole. The entire surface was polished with increasingly fine abrasives until the earlier marks disappeared or became difficult to see. This was patient work. If the craftsperson rushed, the object might crack after weeks of effort. If the drill was badly aligned, the central opening could be uneven. If too much material was removed from one side, perfect symmetry became impossible. The final polish also required time, especially on a large object. A smooth Liangzhu jade may look simple in a museum case, but its simplicity was expensive. The raw material had to reach the workshop before any of this could begin. The exact sources of Liangzhu nephrite have been debated for decades. Geological and chemical studies suggest that at least some came from the Xiaomeiling deposit in present-day Jiangsu, although researchers continue to investigate whether several sources supplied different workshops. Variations in material and production evidence also suggest that jade resources were distributed through an organised system rather than gathered casually by anyone who happened to find an attractive stone near a river. Control of raw jade would have created another source of power. The material was limited, skilled workers were limited. The time required for production was considerable. A household could not decide one afternoon to make a large ceremonial tube before dinner. It needed access to stone, specialist knowledge, tools, abrasives, food for the workers, and permission or support from people who controlled those resources. This makes jade different from many ordinary grave goods. A pottery bowl could be important, but pottery was produced in large quantities for daily life. A polished stone tool required skill, yet tools were needed by most households. A large, finely made jade object represented labour that had been removed from farming, construction, food processing, and other practical work. Placing it in a grave permanently took that labour and material out of circulation. The richest Liangzhu tombs did this repeatedly. At Fanshan, excavators found more than 1,200 objects or sets of objects made from jade, stone, ivory, lacquer and other materials in a cemetery containing high-status burials. Jade formed the overwhelming majority of the surviving grave goods. The people buried there were not simply wealthier versions of ordinary farmers. Their graves presented them as members of a separate social level. The placement of jade around the body also appears to have followed rules. Different forms were positioned near the head, chest, arms, waist or legs. Some objects were arranged in groups. Ceremonial axes were associated with particular individuals. Large numbers of discs and tubes appeared in the graves of the highest-ranking dead. The pattern suggests a formal burial system in which each kind of object carried an accepted meaning. That meaning is difficult to recover because Liangzhu left no readable explanation. Modern names such as Cong, Bai, and Yue come from much later Chinese traditions. We use them because they help classify the objects, not because archaeologists know what Liangzhu people called them. Later texts connected round Bai discs with heaven and square Cong tubes with earth, but those explanations were written long after the Liangzhu civilization had ended. There is no direct evidence that Liangzhu people used exactly the same interpretation. The best-known form is the Cong. A Cong usually has a square or nearly square outer shape with a circular hole running through the centre. Short examples may have only one decorated section. Tall examples can contain many repeated sections stacked above one another. Some surviving Cong are close to 1/2 metre tall, which required a large piece of suitable stone and an impressive amount of drilling. The contrast between the square exterior and round opening is deliberate. The form is too consistent across many examples to be an accidental result of manufacture. The hole may have allowed the object to be mounted, held, or combined with something made from wood or another material, although the exact use remains uncertain. Most complete examples are known from burials, and any organic fittings have usually disappeared. Cong are often decorated at their corners. At first glance, the designs may look like simple horizontal bands, circles, and shallow projections. Once the pattern is recognized, faces begin to appear. Some have round eyes beneath bands that may represent a headdress. Others have larger oval or rounded triangular eyes, a broad nose, and a mouth. On highly detailed examples, the design becomes a complex image combining a human-like figure with an animal-like face. Researchers often refer to this as the deity and animal motif, the divine human and beast image, or a related description. The upper figure may wear a broad feathered headdress and rest on or control the creature below. Bent arms and hands sometimes appear at the sides. The lower face has large eyes and features that do not correspond neatly to one real animal. It may represent a deity, ancestor, spirit, ritual specialist, mythical creature, or a combination of several ideas. The honest answer is that nobody can identify it with certainty. It is also unwise to assume it had one meaning for the entire 1,000-year history of Liangzhu. Symbols can change while the basic design remains familiar. What can be observed is its repetition. The same general image appears on Cong, ceremonial axes, all-shaped objects, ornaments, and other prestigious items. Some versions are extraordinarily detailed. Others reduce the face to a few lines and circles. This suggests that Liangzhu craftspeople and viewers could recognize the symbol even in abbreviated form, rather as a familiar emblem remains identifiable after most of its detail has been removed. The ability to recognize the image may have separated insiders from outsiders. A visitor unfamiliar with Liangzhu ritual might see geometric marks. A local participant may have understood which figure was shown, what ceremony it referred to, and what position the owner held. Shared symbols allow institutions to communicate without lengthy explanations, which is convenient when writing has not yet become available, and everyone would prefer the ritual not to pause for a 40-minute briefing. Birds also appear on some Liangzhu jades. A Cong from the Fuquanshan site carries images interpreted by the Shanghai Museum as flying birds beside the combined deity and animal masks. The museum describes the birds as messengers of the deity, although this remains an interpretation rather than a surviving Liangzhu explanation. Their presence shows that the main face motif could be placed within a larger set of sacred images. The buzz was another major jade form. It was a flat disc with a hole in the centre. Some were carefully shaped into regular circles and polished to a strong sheen. Others were less even, retained flaws in the raw stone, or showed marks from manufacture. Many were too large and heavy to function as personal ornaments, and thousands have been found in elite Liangzhu burials. Their precise ritual purpose remains unknown. The B form looks simpler than the Cong, but producing a broad, thin disc without breaking it was demanding. The stone had to be selected carefully. Cutting a slab too thin increased the chance of damage. Drilling the central opening could fracture the entire object near the end of the process. Polishing a large flat surface evenly required control and time. Some were made from better quality material and finished more carefully than others. This variation may reflect differences in rank, workshop skill, raw material access, or purpose. A highly polished disc placed with an elite burial could communicate more than the basic form alone. It showed that the owner had received one of the best available versions. Ceremonial axes carried a more direct connection with authority. The U-axe developed from a practical woodworking or weapon form, but elite Liangzhu examples were made or decorated with jade and were not designed for ordinary labour. Some were combined with fittings and a wooden handle to form a sceptre-like object. The wood usually decayed, leaving the blade and small jade attachments in the grave. An axe can represent the power to cut, punish, command, or lead in conflict. Later Chinese rulers used ceremonial axes as symbols of military and political authority. We cannot simply project all later meanings backward onto Liangzhu, but the restricted appearance of elaborate yi and high-ranking graves strongly suggest that they marked leadership. One famous set from Fanshan Tomb M12 included a jade yue with decorated fittings and the repeated deity and animal motif. The same burial also contained an exceptional Cong and other high-status objects. Museum and site interpretations often connect the Cong with sacred power, the Yu with military or royal authority, and the Bi with elite ritual. That neat division may simplify a more complicated system, but the objects clearly operated together rather than as unrelated possessions. The person buried with them was being presented in several roles. He or she belonged to the higher social group, had access to ritual symbols, and was associated with an emblem of command. The burial ceremony made these claims visible to the living before the grave was closed. Funerals may have been important political events. Preparing an elite tomb required workers, food, grave goods, ritual specialists, and an audience. Valuable objects were arranged around the body. Ceremonies may have taken place over several stages. At Yaoshan, high-status burials were placed in relation to an altar-like construction, strengthening the connection between elite ancestors and formal ritual space. UNESCO includes the socially graded cemeteries and altar among the main evidence for Liangzhu's unified belief system and social hierarchy. The dead could support the authority of the living. A leadership family might claim descent from important ancestors buried with recognized sacred objects. Returning to a cemetery for ceremonies could reinforce that claim. The location of elite graves near the central city made ancestral status part of the political landscape. Fanshan lay close to Mojiaoshan, the large platform interpreted as the central palace or administrative zone. Yaoshan combined elite burials with ceremonial construction. Political power, sacred imagery, and control of valuable goods were therefore concentrated in the same group of places. Liangzhu rulers did not separate government from ritual, in the way a modern office building might be separated from a place of worship. That does not necessarily mean every leader was a priest, or that every ritual specialist was a ruler. It means that authority was supported by sacred practices. A person who controlled labour, rice and water could also present that control as part of a larger moral or supernatural order. The dams protected fields because people built them, but ceremonies might explain why the leadership had the right to direct that work. The repeated jade motif may have represented the source of this right. Perhaps the figure showed an ancestor who first established the social order. Perhaps it showed a deity approached by ritual specialists. Perhaps the animal face represented a dangerous force brought under control. These possibilities are often discussed, but none can be confirmed. The uncertainty is useful because it prevents the objects from becoming illustrations for a story invented by modern viewers. We can say that the image was standardized, widely recognized, and concentrated on high-status ritual objects. We can say that producing those objects required specialists and controlled resources. We can say that they appeared in burials designed to display inequality. Beyond that, interpretation needs to remain careful. The same caution applies to the word religion. Liangzhu people probably did not divide life into separate religious, political, and economic categories. A ceremony involving jade could honour ancestors, confirm a leader's position, organise seasonal work, redistribute food, and strengthen ties between settlements at the same time. A gathering held before planting or after harvest may have included offerings and feasting. Leaders could display jades that ordinary people rarely handled. The repeated imagery reminded participants that the local community belonged to a wider Liangzhu order. Rice and meat could be distributed from central stores. Agreements about labour, water, marriage, exchange, or conflict might be confirmed during the same event. The jade did not need to perform a practical mechanical function. Its function was social. It identified people and occasions. It connected present leaders with ancestors or spirits. It showed that the owner had access to the best material and the most skilled workers. It also created an object that could survive long after cloth, feathers, food, wood, and spoken words had disappeared. This durability may have mattered to Liangzhu people. Nephrite resists wear. It can retain a polish through long use. It does not rust, rot, or burn easily. A jade object could pass from one generation to another before finally being buried. Some pieces may have been made specifically for funerals, while others may have been used in ceremonies during life. Archaeologists can sometimes identify repair or reworking, showing that an object remained valuable after being damaged. A cracked jade did not necessarily become waste. It could be polished again, drilled in a new position, reduced in size, or placed in a grave despite the flaw. The material and symbolic form remained important even when perfection was lost. Liangzhu jade also varied by location. Elite sites near the centre had the richest collections and some of the finest workmanship. Other cemeteries contained fewer jades, simpler forms, or lower quality stone. This hierarchy extended across the wider cultural region. Differences appeared not only between individuals in one cemetery, but between entire cemeteries, suggesting several levels of elite status rather than one powerful family surrounded by an otherwise equal population. A regional leader may have controlled more valuable jades than a local leader. A local leader may have received forms associated with the central belief system, but made from less desirable material. Ordinary people may have owned small ornaments or no jade at all. The distribution allowed the same symbolic system to connect the region while preserving differences in rank. This is a very effective political arrangement. Everyone recognizes the symbol, but not everyone receives the same version. A small jade ornament may show membership. A large Cong shows privilege. A decorated ceremonial axe shows command. The system creates unity and inequality at the same time. The workshops that produced these objects were therefore important institutions. Craft specialization is well documented in Liangzhu society, and studies of raw materials and production differences suggest organized labor and a division of tasks. One group may have obtained and selected stone. Another prepared basic blanks. Highly skilled workers completed drilling, detailed incision, and final polishing. Training such workers took years. A beginner could practice on ordinary stone or perform rough grinding. The finest lines on deity and animal motifs required a steady hand and excellent control of abrasives. Some designs contain lines so narrow and closely spaced that they are difficult to appreciate without magnification. Creating them did not require mysterious lost technology. It required time, skill, suitable tools, and experience. Modern people sometimes assume that slow methods are primitive methods. In reality, a craftsperson who spends years learning how different minerals respond to pressure may achieve extraordinary results with simple equipment. The workshops also needed a system for quality control. A powerful household expecting a matched set of ritual objects would not be pleased to receive one polished Cong, two uneven discs, and an axe fitting with the sacred face accidentally leaning to the left. Templates, measurements, demonstration pieces, and shared training may have helped maintain consistent forms. Standardization did not remove individual skill. Different workshops and periods developed variations in proportion, decoration, and finish. Tool Cong became common in some areas. Shorter, finely carved examples were important in others. Motifs could be detailed or abbreviated. The basic visual language remained stable enough to connect them. Liangzhu jade traditions later influenced other regions. Cong and bee forms appeared in cultures beyond the lower Yangtze and continued into later periods, although their meanings changed. By the time later Chinese scholars wrote about them, the original Liangzhu rituals had been forgotten. Some ancient Cong were collected, copied, or reinterpreted during historical dynasties. The survival of the forms does not mean an unbroken religious tradition ran unchanged for thousands of years. Objects can outlive the ideas that created them. A later ruler might value a Cong as an ancient ritual object, without knowing how it had been used at Liangzhu. New explanations could be attached to the old shape. This happened because the objects were durable and unusual. A square tube with a circular bore invites interpretation. It looks deliberate, but it does not explain itself. Later viewers connected it with their own systems of heaven, earth direction, ancestry, and ritual order. For Liangzhu itself, the jades provide the clearest evidence that power was not based only on managing food and water. It was also presented through controlled ceremony. The leadership did not rely on practical competence alone. It surrounded authority with sacred objects, repeated images, elite burials, and locations that linked rulers with ancestors or spirits. The system would have affected many people who never owned a large jade. Farmers produced the surplus that fed craftspeople. Labourers built the platforms where ceremonies took place. Boat crews transported raw stone. Miners or collectors obtained the material. Potters made vessels used during gatherings. Woodworkers created handles, stands, coffins, buildings, and fittings that have mostly disappeared. A finished jade concentrated all of that work into one object, then made the object appear to belong naturally to the person who wore, displayed, or received it. The farmer's rice, the boat crew's journey, and the craftsperson's months of grinding were no longer visible. What remained was the polished symbol of authority. That transformation is common in unequal societies. Valuable objects hide the labour behind them. A ceremonial axe presents power as something held by one individual, even though hundreds of people may have contributed to making the ceremony possible. Liangzhu jade did this very effectively because it was scarce, durable, visually distinctive, and linked with beliefs shared across the region. The cemeteries allow us to see the top of this system, but they can distort our view if we look at nothing else. Most Liangzhu inhabitants were not buried with dozens of jades. They lived among ordinary pottery, wooden tools, baskets, fishing equipment, rice processing stones, and houses that needed regular repair. They may have seen the finest jade only during important ceremonies. Some may have worked in the workshops without ever owning what they produced. Others carried rice to central stores, maintained channels, or transported stone toward the city. The sacred world depended on daily labour, carried out behind the walls, in houses, yards, workshops, kitchens, and crowded boats. To understand how Liangzhu actually functioned, we now have to leave the richest graves and follow those people into the inhabited areas around Mojiaoshan. The polished objects tell us how power wished to be seen. The broken pottery, food remains, tools, post holes, and workshop waste show the society that kept that power working from one day to the next. The polished objects tell us how Liangzhu's most powerful people wanted to be seen. The remains of houses, kitchens, workshops, tools, and food tell us how the city functioned when no ceremony was taking place. Most people who lived behind the walls did not spend their days carrying jade axes or standing on palace platforms. They worked, repaired buildings, moved goods, prepared meals, raised children, cleaned channels, and tried to keep dampness out of places where dampness was not welcome. The inner city covered about 3 square kilometres, but much of that ground had originally been marshland. Before people could live there, they had to create raised surfaces. They dug mud and silt from channels, carried in additional earth, and built terraces above the wet ground. More than 20 artificial terraces have been identified within the inner city. Houses and workshops stood on these raised areas, while rivers, moats, and smaller channels passed between them. Liangzhu was therefore not a solid block of buildings divided by dry streets. It was a collection of occupied platforms linked by boats, paths, banks, and bridges. A household living on one of these terraces would have been very aware of the condition of its foundation. Packed earth settles, heavy rain cuts small channels through exposed surfaces. Water collects around posts. Reeds and weeds take hold quickly near an unused edge. Keeping a house dry required regular attention to roofs, floors, drains, and banks. The surviving evidence suggests that buildings were constructed mainly from timber, earth, reeds, and other plant materials. Wooden posts supported the roof. Walls may have been made from woven plant material coated with mud, boards, or a combination of methods. Roofs were probably thatched. Floors could be prepared from compacted earth and renewed when they became uneven or dirty. These materials were practical in a region with forests, wetlands, and clay. They were also temporary. Roof thatch had to be replaced. Wooden posts weakened in damp soil. Mud walls cracked during dry weather and softened during heavy rain. A Liangzhu house was not something a family built once and then ignored for the next 30 years. It was an ongoing maintenance arrangement with sleeping space included. Archaeologists often find the lower parts of such buildings rather than the complete structures. Post holes show where vertical supports once stood. Trenches can mark wall lines. Hardened floor surfaces reveal areas of repeated use. Ash, burnt soil, and charcoal indicate hearths or fires. Pits may have been used for storage, waste, or other household activities. One post hole is not especially informative on its own. A carefully arranged group of them can reveal the outline of a building. Several buildings arranged on the same terrace may show a neighbourhood. Rebuilding in the same place leaves overlapping post patterns, which can be difficult to interpret but also shows that people occupied the area for a long time. House size and location probably differed according to status. Larger structures occupied the central Mojioshan platform, which is generally interpreted as a palace or administrative area. Ordinary residences stood on smaller terraces in the inner and outer city. Some people also lived or worked on raised sections near the city walls. The official Liangzhu site interpretation estimates that the combined residential zones of the wider city system may have supported around 30,000 inhabitants, although prehistoric population figures remain approximate. 30,000 people would require a great deal of food, fuel, water, pottery, timber, clothing, and patience. They would not all know one another. Different neighbourhoods probably developed their own routines and local relationships. Families might share work areas, river landings, ovens, wells, or storage facilities. People living near a workshop face different daily conditions from those living beside a quiet residential channel. The term household also needs to be used cautiously. We do not know exactly how Liangzhu families were organised. A house might contain parents and children, several generations, related couples, servants, apprentices or workers attached to an elite institution. The building remains rarely tell us who slept in which position, or who complained most often about somebody leaving tools near the entrance. Daily activity began with water. People needed it for drinking, cooking, cleaning, pottery production, woodworking, rice processing, animals, and construction. The city's channel network made water easy to reach, but river water was not automatically clean. Waste, sediment, animals, workshop debris, and boat traffic affected its quality. Wells have been found at Liangzhu period sites, especially in agricultural areas, showing that people sometimes preferred controlled local sources. Carrying water was repetitive work. Containers filled at a riverbank or well had to be moved into houses and workshops. Large pottery jars could store water, but they were heavy even before anything was poured into them. Wooden buckets and woven containers may also have been used, although organic materials survive less often. Fire was another household necessity. Cooking fires heated food and water. Fires provided light, dried damp objects, and made cooler periods more comfortable. Workshops used controlled heat for pottery, lacquer preparation, woodworking processes, and other activities. Fuel had to be collected, cut, transported, and kept dry. A wet region can have a large supply of wood and still make firewood management irritating. Freshly cut timber burns badly. Wood stored too close to damp ground absorbs moisture. Thatch catches fire rather more enthusiastically than anyone would like. The large deposit of carbonized rice found near Mojiaoshan may have come from a granary fire, although the exact event remains uncertain. The estimated surviving quantity was about 13,000 kilograms, suggesting that major food stores existed near the central area. The presence of so much stored rice near the centre does not mean rice was grown inside the city. The Liangzhu Site Authority reports that no paddy fields have been identified within the urban area or its immediate surroundings, supporting the idea that grain was brought in from rural settlements farther away. The city depended on a wider farming population, while its inhabitants concentrated on administration, ritual, construction, transport and craft production. Farmers outside the city followed the seasonal demands of wet rice agriculture. Fields had to be prepared, planted, weeded, watered, drained, harvested and cleared. Some labour was organised at household level, while larger fields and water systems required cooperation between several households or settlements. Rice was carried into the city after harvesting and processing. The grain might arrive in baskets, jars, sacks made from plant fibre, or bulk loads on boats. It then had to be measured and stored. Part remained available for everyday meals. Some may have supported workers assigned to public construction. Some could have been reserved for ceremonies, emergencies, or redistribution by the elite. The route from field to bowl involved more work than the final meal suggests. Rice had to be separated from stalks and husks. It could be pounded with wooden tools, cleaned in baskets, and washed before cooking. Broken grains and husks accumulated around processing areas. Archaeobotanists recover charred grains, husk fragments, weed seeds, and microscopic plant remains to understand these activities. Rice became increasingly important across the lower Yangtze during the Liangzhu period. A 2024 isotopic study combining evidence from humans, animals and plants found growing reliance on domesticated rice and pigs in parts of the region. People in the Liangzhu core had diets based heavily on C3 plants, especially rice, while still eating meat and freshwater resources. The study also found that individuals from the core area Merendi site had higher nitrogen isotope values than people at the inland Sanxingqun site, suggesting access to more animal protein, although this difference cannot be assigned neatly to every social class. Fish and other aquatic foods remained important. Rivers, lakes, marshes, and managed reservoirs supported freshwater fish, turtles, shellfish, and water birds. Fishing could be done with nets, baskets, traps, hooks, spears, or by collecting animals from shallow water. Many tools made from wood, fibre and bone have not survived in large numbers, so the full range of methods is difficult to reconstruct. A fishing trip might supply one household or produce enough for exchange. Small fish could be cooked whole. Larger catches could be dried, smoked or otherwise preserved, though direct evidence for every preservation method is limited. Shellfish and snails offered food that required little equipment beyond collecting and cooking, followed by a surprisingly large pile of shells. Pigs were kept by Liangzhu communities, but animal use varied across the region. Zooarchaeological and isotopic research suggests that lower Yangtze societies continued to make considerable use of wild resources even as urbanism and farming expanded. Domestic pigs were important, yet they did not completely replace hunting, fishing and gathering. Pigs fit well into settled farming life because they can eat household waste and agricultural byproducts. They also fit rather less well into tidy residential areas because they dig, push, escape, and investigate objects with confidence. Keeping them required pens, feeding, and decisions about when to slaughter them. Deer, birds, and other wild animals were hunted. Antlers found at Liangzhu sites confirm the presence and use of deer. Hunting provided meat, hides, bone, antler, feathers, and materials for tools. It also took people outside the managed urban and farming landscape into woodland, marsh, and higher ground. The diet of an elite household was probably not identical to that of a labouring family, although the evidence does not allow a complete menu for each social group. Elites had greater control over stores and access to ceremonial feasts. They may have eaten more meat or received preferred cuts. Ordinary residents relied more directly on rice, fish, plants and whatever animal foods were available locally. Food differences could become visible during public events. A ceremony might include large quantities of rice, pig meat, fish, or fermented drinks. Pottery vessels were used for serving and consumption. Distributing food allowed leaders to reward supporters, host visitors, and turn stored surplus into political relationships. Pottery was present in nearly every part of daily life. Coarse vessels cooked food over fires. Larger jars stored grain, water, or other goods. Bowls and cups were used for eating and drinking. Fine black pottery appeared in higher status and ceremonial settings. Lids, stands, and specialised vessel shapes served particular tasks. A potter began by selecting clay. Clay dug from one location might be too sticky, too sandy, or filled with unwanted material. It could be cleaned, mixed, and combined with temper to reduce cracking. The vessel was shaped by hand, with coils, paddles, anvils, or rotating supports, depending on the form and technique. Surfaces could be smoothed, burnished, slipped, painted, or decorated. Firing required fuel and careful temperature control. A vessel placed too close to intense heat could warp or crack. Poor airflow produced uneven results. Fine black surfaces required control of the atmosphere inside the firing area. The work was technical, and repeated success suggests trained producers rather than occasional household experimentation alone. Recent chemical analysis of pottery from 2 Liangzhu cemeteries provides evidence that pottery production differed by social group. Vessels from the elite Yangtze cemetery appear to have been produced specifically for funerary events, with elite involvement in their manufacture. Pottery from the commoner cemetery at Bianjishan came from more stable and varied production sources organised by vessel texture or type. Jade was therefore not the only material through which elite identity was expressed. Special pottery could also be commissioned for high-status burials. Most pottery used in ordinary homes was less carefully treated. It needed to survive cooking, carrying and storage rather than impress a funeral audience. When a vessel broke, people could repair it if the damage was manageable, reuse pieces for other purposes, or discard them. Pottery fragments might serve as scoops, scrapers, lids, spindle whorls, or simple working surfaces. Broken pottery helps archaeologists locate activity areas. A cluster of cooking pot fragments and ash suggests domestic work. Misfired vessels and lumps of burnt clay may indicate pottery production. Similar clay composition across several sites can show that vessels move from one workshop to multiple consumers. Workshop evidence is especially important at Zhongjiagang, where residences and specialised production areas stood beside an ancient river course. Timber piles protected the banks, and the waterway connected the inside and outside of the eastern wall. Raw materials could arrive by boat, while finished goods left by the same route. The area has been interpreted as a centre for residential life and handicraft production within the city. Jade production required the slow processes already described, but other crafts demanded equal attention. Woodworkers shaped posts, planks, boat parts, handles, containers, furniture, tools, and ceremonial fittings. Stone axes could cut timber, especially when mounted securely and used by an experienced worker. Large trees had to be felled, trimmed, and moved through the waterways. Boat builders held a particularly important position. Without reliable vessels, the city's transport system could not function. A boat needed suitable timber, careful shaping, and an understanding of balance. A vessel designed for shallow channels differed from one expected to carry heavy stone or timber. Repairs were frequent. Boats struck hidden branches, dragged across shallow ground, and absorbed water. Cracks had to be sealed, damaged paddles were replaced, mooring points and landing areas required maintenance. A boat owner who ignored a small leak might receive a useful lesson in the difference between optimism and buoyancy. Lacquer production was another specialised craft associated with Liangzhu. Lacquer comes from tree sap and requires careful collection and processing. It can be applied in multiple layers over wooden or other organic bases, creating a durable and attractive surface. Lacquered items were found in high-status contexts, sometimes combined with jade. Because wood and lacquer decay more easily than stone, the surviving objects probably represent only a fraction of the original production. Elite graves that now appear dominated by jade may once have contained richly decorated wooden containers, handles, furniture, and other items whose shapes have disappeared. Textile work also took place, although cloth rarely survives in the region's soil. Spindle whorls show that fibres were spun into thread. A whorl added weight to a spindle, helping it rotate steadily while the spinner twisted fibres. Different whorl weights and shapes could produce different kinds of thread. Evidence from East Asian sites indicates that Liangzhu communities had a distinctive and well-developed spinning tradition within the wider history of regional textile production. The fibres may have included plant materials such as hemp, rami, or other locally available species. Silk use has sometimes been discussed in relation to Neolithic Lower Yangtze societies, but direct evidence specific to every Liangzhu context is limited and should not be exaggerated. What can be said safely is that people needed cloth, cord, nets, bags, mats, ropes, and bindings, and that producing them required a large amount of labour. Spinning could be done while supervising children, talking with neighbours, or waiting for another task. Weaving required prepared thread and some form of loom. Plant fibres had to be collected, cleaned, softened, joined, and twisted before weaving began. A finished garment represented many hours of work even when it looked plain. Clothing probably differed by season, task, and status. Farmers needed garments that allowed movement in wet fields. Boat crews needed clothing that could cope with spray and rain. Craft workers avoided loose material near moving drills or cutting tools, assuming they valued their sleeves. Elite dress may have included finer textiles, feathers, jade ornaments, lacquered fittings, and carefully arranged headwear. Personal ornaments were not limited to large ritual jades. Beads, pendants, bracelets, and other small objects could show age, affiliation, family position, or local status. Hairstyles, body decoration, clothing colour, and perishable accessories may have communicated information that archaeology can no longer recover. The division of labour was probably complex, but assigning every task according to modern assumptions would be unsafe. Skeletal analysis, burial patterns, tools, and ethnographic comparison can suggest possibilities, yet they do not provide a complete schedule divided by sex and age. Women may have been heavily involved in food preparation and textile production, as in many farming societies, but they could also have farmed, fished, traded, crafted, or held ritual status. Men may have done much of the heavy construction or hunting, but they were not absent from household work. Children contributed as soon as they were capable. They could gather fuel, scare birds from fields, carry small loads, collect shellfish, watch animals, help process grain, and learn crafts through observation. A jade specialist did not begin with the finest Cong. Training probably started with simple grinding, tool preparation, and watching an experienced worker correct mistakes. Apprenticeship created relationships between generations. Technical knowledge belonged not only to individuals but to families, workshops, or institutions. A craftsperson who knew how to drill nephrite, prepare black pottery, or build a stable boat possessed knowledge valuable to the city. Some specialists may have worked independently and exchanged their products. Others may have been attached to elite households or central workshops. The scale and standardization of Liangzhu crafts suggests that important production was organized beyond the household level. Archaeological summaries identify craft specialization, strong social differentiation, and a regional urban center as key features of Liangzhu society. Specialization did not mean a worker performed only one task throughout life. A potter might also farm during busy seasons. A boat builder might join a dam repair crew. A jade worker still needed to obtain food, maintain a house, and help with family obligations. Full-time specialisation was most likely for highly skilled craft supported directly by surplus collected at the centre. The city required workers whose products were not objects. Boat crews moved materials. Labour supervisors organised construction. People maintained walls, terraces, banks and canals. Guards or gatekeepers may have controlled entrances. Storehouse workers received and distributed grain. Ritual specialists prepared ceremonies. Messengers travelled between the city and distant settlements. There may also have been people responsible for resolving disputes and enforcing decisions. A city of several thousand inhabitants could not depend entirely on informal agreement. Boats collided. Property was damaged. Fields competed for water. Work obligations were missed. Stored goods disappeared for reasons that were probably described as misunderstandings. No law code survives, so the methods of enforcement are unknown. Authority may have operated through kin groups, local leaders, elite officials, ritual sanctions, public pressure or physical punishment. Ceremonial axes suggest that leadership included the power to command, but they do not tell us how often force was used. Social rank was built into the city's layout. Mojiushan occupied the central and highest artificial platform. Elite cemeteries stood nearby. Workshops and residential terraces spread around them. The walls and water gates controlled access. Beyond the inner city lay outer settlements, and beyond those were rural communities producing food and materials. The hierarchy was even clearer in depth. UNESCO identifies socially graded cemeteries as one of the defining features of Liangzhu. Rich burials contained large quantities of jade and other special goods, while lower status graves held fewer objects and simpler pottery. Differences occurred both between individuals in the same cemetery and between cemeteries, indicating several levels of status across the region. Bianjishan has been described as a cemetery associated with commoners, while Jiangjishan belonged to an elite group below or alongside the highest-ranking individuals at Fanshan. These distinctions suggest that Liangzhu society was not divided into only rulers and everyone else. There were likely several ranks, including central elites, lesser elites, local leaders, specialists, ordinary urban residents, farmers, and labourers. Rank may have affected where people lived, which food they received, what work they performed, and how they were buried. It may also have shaped marriage. Elite families could have formed alliances with other high-status groups in the wider Liangzhu region, helping the centre maintain influence over distant settlements. The evidence for exact marriage rules is limited, so this remains an inference rather than a confirmed practice. The palace area did not produce its own food, which made the elite dependent on deliveries. That dependence did not make elites powerless. It meant they controlled a system capable of bringing rural surplus toward the centre. Grain, animals, timber, stone, jade, and labour entered the city through channels and gates. Finished objects, instructions, ritual symbols, and possibly redistributed food moved outward. People in the countryside were essential to urban life. A resident of the central platform could not eat authority, however finely polished it might be. The city survived because farmers planted rice, fishers worked the waterways, craftspeople made tools, and labourers repaired the infrastructure. The relationship between centre and countryside may have included trade as well as obligation. Farmers could exchange grain for pottery, tools, ornaments, salt, or access to ceremonies and water systems. Local leaders may have collected contributions on behalf of the centre. Seasonal gatherings brought people together for work and ritual. Some movement into the city was temporary. Farmers might arrive to deliver grain. Labour crews came for wall or canal repairs. Visitors attended ceremonies. Traders and boat operators passed through. The urban population therefore changed with the agricultural and ritual calendar. Busy periods would have produced crowded landings and channels. Boats waited to unload. Baskets and jars were counted. Animals resisted cooperation. Workers searched for the person who was supposed to know where the timber should go. A planned city did not eliminate confusion. It gave confusion designated places to occur. At quieter times, neighbourhood activity continued. Potters prepared clay, spinners produced thread, children carried water. Older people repaired nets or sorted food. Smoke rose from hearths, boats moved between terraces, waste accumulated and had to be removed or pushed toward areas where later archaeologists would be grateful to find it. Disease and injury were part of this life. Wet environments can support mosquitoes, parasites, contaminated water, and infections. Repetitive farming and construction strain joints and backs. Stone tools cut skin as well as wood. Fires burn. Boats overturn. Childbirth carried serious risk. Archaeological human remains can reveal age, disease, trauma, nutrition, and physical workload, but preservation and sample size limit what can be said about the whole population. Elite cemeteries are more visible than ordinary burials, which can make the people with the easiest lives easier to study than those who carried most of the earth. The city's success lasted for centuries because this large population continued to cooperate, whether through agreement, obligation, or pressure. Houses were rebuilt, workshops trained new craftspeople, farmers supplied grain, dams and channels were maintained, elite ceremonies repeated familiar symbols and confirmed the social order. Nothing in the archaeological record suggests that daily life was motionless. The city changed as new terraces were added, waterways shifted, workshops moved, and buildings were replaced. Production became more specialized, burials became more regulated. The central authority appears to have grown stronger before the final period of decline. Greater organization brought advantages. It allowed Liangzhu to store food, support skilled crafts, protect fields, and carry out construction at an exceptional scale. It also created dependence on systems that had to keep functioning together. Urban residents depended on rural harvests. Rural farmers depended on water management. Workshops depended on imported materials and stored food. Elites depended on the labour and acceptance of people below them. When rainfall remained within manageable limits and harvests were good, the arrangement could support a large population. When a channel failed, a field flooded, or a storehouse burned, reserves and organised labour helped the city recover. The system had survived ordinary difficulties many times. The danger came from changes that were no longer ordinary. A wetland city can raise its floors, strengthen its banks and hold back mountain runoff. But every construction has a limit. Sediment continued to build. Rivers continued to move. The climate did not promise to behave according to Liangzhu's work schedule. Near the end of the civilization's long occupation, evidence from caves, lake deposits, settlement layers, and abandoned fields begins to show a period of severe environmental disruption. The people behind the walls had spent generations organizing water. The conditions approaching the lower Yangtze would test whether even that remarkable system could continue to protect the society built around it. The warning signs may have appeared gradually. A channel filled more quickly than usual. A field stayed flooded after the rain should have drained away. Repairs to an embankment lasted for one season instead of several. Families living on lower terraces moved their stored grain to higher ground, perhaps as a precaution at first. Liangzhu had always been a wet place, so none of these events would have seemed completely unfamiliar. The city had been built by people who understood floods and had spent generations preparing for them. For centuries, that preparation had worked. Reservoirs slowed water arriving from the hills. Lower dams stored and redirected runoff across the plain. Raised platforms protected houses, workshops, and important buildings. Channels carried excess water away while also supporting boats and trade. Rice fields were placed where water could be used rather than merely endured. Liangzhu's success had depended on turning a difficult environment into a managed one. The problem was that a managed landscape is not the same as a controlled landscape. Every wall, dam, ditch, and raised floor had limits. A structure designed for normal seasonal flooding might survive one unusually heavy storm. It might even survive several. Repeated extreme rainfall over years or decades creates a different problem. Soil remains saturated. Reservoirs cannot empty before the next storm arrives. Rivers carry more sediment. Drainage slows. A repair crew finishes one damaged section and discovers that two more have begun to fail. Archaeologists generally place the end of the Liangzhu culture at around 2300 BCE, or approximately 4,300 years before the present. The ancient city was abandoned, large-scale elite construction stopped, and the political and ritual system visible in the richer cemeteries disappeared. The timing is clear enough to identify a major change, but the process behind it remains debated. Liangzhu left no written account of its final years, so researchers must reconstruct the decline from sediments, pollen, abandoned settlements, human activity indicators, climate records, and the position of flood deposits above archaeological layers. Several explanations have been proposed. Some researchers have considered military conflict, internal political struggle, changing social organisation, colder conditions, rising sea levels, river flooding, coastal storm surges, or a combination of environmental and human pressures. The most widely supported explanation now gives a major role to extreme rainfall and prolonged flooding, but that does not mean archaeologists have discovered one flood with a convenient label saying that it ended the civilization. The strongest recent climate evidence comes from caves several hundred kilometers southwest of Liangzhu. Inside Shenong and Julong caves, mineral deposits called speleothems formed as water moved through rock and deposited thin layers of calcite. Stalagmites can preserve chemical changes connected with rainfall above the cave. By dating those layers and measuring their chemical composition, researchers reconstructed changes in regional moisture over thousands of years. A cave record does not tell us whether a particular Liangzhu house lost its roof on a Tuesday afternoon. It provides a regional climate sequence. Researchers compared that sequence with archaeological dates and flood sediments from the lower Yangtze. Their results identified two unusually wet episodes near the end of Liangzhu's history. The first occurred roughly between 4,423 and 4,404 years before the present. A second and stronger wet interval occurred between approximately 4,345 and 4,324 years before the present, closely matching the period when the Liangzhu center was abandoned. The dates include uncertainty because ancient climate events do not arrive with printed calendars. Even so, the overlap is close. Flood deposits have been found above late Liangzhu cultural layers at several sites, including Yushan. One dated flood layer there falls near the earlier wet episode, while another aligns with the later event associated with the civilization's decline. Researchers argue that the second period brought rainfall and inundation on a scale not experienced during the previous centuries of Liangzhu development. Imagine the effect on a society whose main food system depended on low rice fields. Rice requires water, but plants cannot survive indefinitely beneath deep, stagnant flooding. Seedlings can be washed away, mature crops can be flattened, harvested grain can rot before it dries. Storage buildings become vulnerable when groundwater rises or roofs leak through repeated storms. One poor harvest could be covered by reserves. Liangzhu stored large quantities of rice and possessed a system capable of moving food between settlements. A second poor year would place more pressure on those reserves. If several productive areas failed together, the problem could no longer be solved by bringing grain from the next village, because the next village might be looking at the same flooded fields. Transport would also become unreliable. Liangzhu normally benefited from boats, channels and reservoirs. During extreme flooding, useful waterways lose their predictable boundaries. Currents become stronger. Banks disappear beneath the water. Floating timber and debris block narrow routes. Boats carrying grain or repair materials may be delayed precisely when they are most needed. The hydraulic system itself could become a source of danger. Reservoirs stored water because dams prevented it from moving downstream all at once. Once a reservoir reached capacity, additional rainfall had to pass through spillways or flow around the system. If those outlets became blocked, water could rise toward the crest. If a section of earthwork weakened, even a partial breach could release a large flow into already saturated lower land. No direct evidence currently allows researchers to describe a complete chain of dam failures across Liangzhu. The climate study proposes that unprecedented rainfall may have destroyed or overwhelmed the hydraulic complex and flooded the low-lying rice zone, but the exact behaviour of each ancient dam remains unknown. The important point is that infrastructure designed to reduce ordinary flood risk could not necessarily protect the city from a long period of extreme regional rainfall. Drainage was probably as serious a problem as the incoming water. Liangzhu occupied a very low plain where excess water could remain after rivers had overflowed. Heavy rain in the hills sent runoff toward the city, while high water farther downstream reduced the ability of local channels to empty. Coastal tides and storm surges may have added pressure in areas nearer Hangzhou Bay. Research into coastal flooding at the end of Liangzhu suggests that some settlements close to the coast were affected by marine water associated with storms or typhoons. Pottery traditions after Liangzhu appear at far fewer coastal plain sites, which supports the idea that large areas became less suitable for dense occupation. Conditions probably differed from one location to another. Inland places faced river and rain flooding, while coastal communities could also face tidal or storm-driven inundation. Sea level change has sometimes been proposed as the direct cause of the collapse, but the regional evidence is more complicated. The lower Yangtze coast had been changing for thousands of years, as sediments built new land and shorelines moved. A sudden, simple rise of the sea does not explain every late Liangzhu deposit. Current studies more often emphasize heavy rainfall, river flooding, poor drainage, storm surges in some coastal areas, and the interaction between these processes. For the people living through it, those distinctions would have mattered less than the practical result. Water entered places where it was not supposed to remain. Floors softened, walls collapsed. Firewood stayed damp. Waste spread into living water. Mosquitoes and waterborne illness may have increased, although direct evidence for specific epidemics at Liangzhu has not been established. Animals needed dry ground and food. Pigs could be moved, but feeding them during crop failure became expensive. Wild resources such as fish might initially become more available in flooded areas, yet fishing could not easily replace the enormous quantity of grain needed by a dense urban population. A city built around agricultural surplus cannot continue at the same scale once the surplus disappears. Social pressure would have increased quickly. Storehouses near the centre may have controlled the remaining food. Officials or elite households had to decide which workers received grain, which damaged structures were repaired, and which settlements received help first. These decisions were political even if the original crisis came from rainfall. A leadership group gains authority when it keeps water predictable and food available. That authority becomes vulnerable when the system fails. Farmers required to provide labour for another dam repair might ask why the previous repair had not protected their fields. Rural settlements expected to send grain to the centre might have nothing left to send. Boat crews could refuse dangerous journeys. Local leaders might keep resources for their own communities rather than forwarding them toward Mojiaoshan. There is no direct record of rebellion, and the archaeological evidence does not currently support a detailed story of crowds attacking the palace. Political conflict is possible, but it should not be added merely because it makes the end more dramatic. What can be said is that environmental failure would have placed exceptional strain on a highly unequal and centralized system. Liangzhu's elite depended on more than fear. Their authority was associated with sacred jade, ancestry, major construction, food storage, and successful landscape management. If ceremonies continued while fields remained underwater, their claims may have become harder to maintain. A ritual object can express power, but it cannot dry several thousand hectares of rice. Some people may have responded by leaving before the central government completely failed. Families living in the most vulnerable settlements could move toward natural hills, better drained areas, or regions beyond the Taihu Plain. Skilled workers might follow relatives or local leaders. Farmers could seek land where rainfall drained more quickly. Movement probably happened in several directions and over more than one season. This may help explain evidence that the decline was not identical everywhere or completely instantaneous. Pollen and charcoal records from the fortified Liangzhu area show that human activity weakened after about 4,500 years ago, before the final date usually assigned to the culture. Rice-related pollen and charcoal concentrations declined at the studied site during the late Liangzhu period, suggesting that abandonment or reduced activity had already begun in some places. The researchers concluded that the demise may have been prolonged rather than one sudden event. That evidence does not necessarily contradict the later study linking collapse with a short period of extreme rainfall. A large society can weaken gradually and then experience a final crisis. Some settlements may decline as channels become harder to maintain or fields become less productive. Population may shift toward the centre or to safer locations. The political system continues, but with fewer resources and less flexibility. A major flood then arrives at a society already spending more effort to keep itself functioning. Alternatively, local weakening recorded at one site might reflect people moving elsewhere within the Liangzhu system rather than an overall regional decline. Archaeological deposits are incomplete, and changes in charcoal or pollen can have several causes. This is why researchers compare many kinds of evidence instead of allowing one trench to speak for an entire civilization. The word collapse can also be misleading. It sounds like every institution stopped on the same day and every resident walked away together. In archaeology, collapse usually describes the end of a particular political, economic or settlement system. People survive, families move, farming continues in other places, pottery styles change, old symbols lose importance or are reused in new ways. After Liangzhu, communities associated with the Qianshanyang and Guangfulin traditions appeared in the lower Yangtze region. Their settlements were fewer, especially across parts of the coastal plain, and their material culture included influences from regions farther north. They did not recreate the same large-walled capital, hydraulic organisation, elite jade system, or level of regional centralisation. This suggests that the population did not simply rebuild Liangzhu a few kilometres away. The social network had changed. A city requires more than surviving individuals. It needs relationships between farmers, storehouses, workshops, local leaders, transport routes, ritual centres, and labour groups. Once those relationships break, rebuilding the same system may be impossible even after the waterfalls. Fields buried beneath flood sediment may need years of work before they become productive again. Channels shift. Reservoirs fill with silt. A workshop loses access to raw jade. Craftspeople disperse among different settlements. Elite families lose the ability to gather labour. Sacred objects remain valuable, but the institutions that assign their rank may no longer exist. People carrying Liangzhu knowledge into new communities would adapt it to different conditions. A farmer still knew how to cultivate rice. A potter still understood clay. A boat builder still knew timber and water. Those skills did not vanish, because Mojiushan was abandoned. What disappeared was the political centre capable of concentrating them on the earlier scale. Migration may also have brought new people into the former Liangzhu region. Some researchers argue that population movements and cultural influence from areas to the north contributed significantly to the changes seen after Liangzhu. Pottery at later sites contains forms associated with other regional traditions, indicating that the lower Yangtze became part of new networks rather than remaining culturally sealed. Environmental instability continued after the initial wet crisis. This speleothem study identifies an extended dry period beginning around 4,000 years ago. several centuries after the extreme wet interval associated with Liangzhu's end. The brief Qianshanyang and Guangfulin cultures occupied part of the period between these events, but later drought and variable climate placed further pressure on lower Yangtze communities. The sequence is rather unfair. First, an exceptionally wet period damages fields and settlements. Later, drier and less predictable conditions make recovery difficult. Water management systems designed for the old pattern may no longer suit the new one. Reservoirs useful in drought may already be damaged or abandoned. Communities that moved to escape floods now face shortages. Researchers have connected these changes with broader shifts in the East Asian monsoon, and possibly a growing influence from the El Niño Southern Oscillation, as summer solar energy in the Northern Hemisphere gradually weakened. This is a large-scale explanation based on several climate records, not a description of weather in every year. The main conclusion is that the lower Yangtze entered a period of greater hydroclimatic instability between roughly 4,300 and 3,000 years ago. Liangzhu had grown during conditions that allowed its people to manage water successfully. The society's engineering was advanced, but it was designed through experience with a particular range of seasonal variation. When that range changed, the very concentration that had made Liangzhu powerful became a weakness. A small village can move relatively quickly. Its houses are limited in number. Food storage is local. Political obligations involve fewer people. A city of many thousands has walls, cemeteries, workshops, terraces, reservoirs, fields, and transport routes that cannot be relocated easily. The larger the investment in one landscape, the harder it is to leave and the greater the loss when leaving becomes necessary. Centralization creates a similar problem. Liangzhu gathered grain and valuable goods toward one centre. It organised labour for major infrastructure. This was efficient when the system worked. During a regional crisis, the same centre had to solve many failures at once. Every flooded settlement asked for support. Every damaged bank needed workers. Every poor harvest reduced the food available to feed those workers. Reserves provide protection, but only temporarily. Once stored grain runs low, leaders must reduce distributions, demand food from places that have little to spare, or abandon some activities. Jade production may stop because craftspeople need to farm or move. Monumental repairs are delayed. Ceremonies become smaller. Distant communities stop receiving benefits from the centre and become less willing to meet its demands. Archaeologists may see the final result as a sharp change in pottery, settlement numbers, burial customs, and construction. The people living through it would have experienced a series of decisions. Do we plant this field again? Do we repair this house or move to higher ground? Do we send workers to the dam? Do we give grain to the central store? Do we bury an important person with the traditional jade objects when food is scarce? At some point, enough answers changed that the Liangzhu system could no longer reproduce itself. A ruler might still claim authority, but the channels were not maintained. A ritual specialist might still understand the old ceremonies, but fewer communities attended them. A jade worker might still possess the skill to carve the sacred face, but no elite household could supply the stone and food required for months of work. The city was then abandoned, although abandonment may have taken place over several years. Valuable portable goods were removed when possible. Heavy objects could be left behind. Timber was reused or decayed. Roofs collapsed. Unmaintained channels filled with sediment. Water spread across lower zones. Vegetation returned to places that had once been cleared and occupied. Pollen evidence indicates that mixed subtropical forest recovered after human activity declined in the Liangzhu area. Reduced burning and farming allowed trees to expand again. This regrowth supports the conclusion that dense settlement and cultivation had ended, even though the regional climate remained broadly warm and humid during the immediate post-Liangzhu period. The forest did not remember where an official storehouse had stood. Roots entered prepared floors. Animals moved through former residential areas. Flood sediment covered pottery and tools. Farmers from later periods returned to parts of the landscape without knowing the full scale of the buried city below them. Some structures survived as low ridges. The great dams became part of the hills and fields. The city walls settled beneath later soil. Mojiaoshan remained raised, but its artificial origin was forgotten. Jade objects stayed inside sealed tombs, protected because the civilization had placed them beyond ordinary reach. Liangzhu did not disappear from every later tradition. Jade forms such as Cong and Bi continued to be collected, copied and reinterpreted in later China. Their original ritual meanings were lost, but the objects themselves survived well enough to attract new explanations. Later societies could hold a Liangzhu jade without knowing the name of the person buried with it. Archaeological evidence from sites such as Tiaotu also shows that post-Liangzhu history was not an empty gap. Communities in the lower Yangtze continued adapting, farming, producing pottery, and interacting with cultures to the north and south. Some sites preserved occupation across several later cultural periods, and more complex settlements eventually reappeared. This continuation matters because it changes how collapse should be understood. Liangzhu's state ended. Its capital lost its central role. Its regional hierarchy and elite jade system were not restored in their earlier form. The people and many of their skills continued through smaller communities, migration, exchange, and new cultural combinations. The flood explanation is therefore strong, without needing to become a simple story in which rain alone erased a civilization. Extreme rainfall appears to have been a major trigger. Low terrain, dependence on rice, damaged infrastructure, political concentration, social inequality, and the difficulty of coordinating recovery shaped the result. Population movement and new cultural influences then changed the region further. A different society might have responded differently to the same weather. A less centralized population could disperse more easily. A society based on several crops might recover faster from flooded rice fields. A city on higher ground would face other problems. Liangzhu's particular strengths had allowed it to dominate the lower Yangtze, but those strengths were tied closely to one landscape and one system of water control. The dams had supported the city. The fields had fed the elite. The channels had connected workshops and settlements. The walls had defined the centre. When water remained outside the expected range, each of those achievements became harder to maintain at the same time. No final message was carved into stone. There is no account from the last ruler, no list of communities that left first, and no record of the final boat departing through a water gate. What remains is a pattern: reduced activity, flood sediments, abandoned fields, disappearing elite burials, changing pottery, fewer settlements, and climate evidence showing rainfall conditions unlike those of the previous centuries. For thousands of years, that pattern stayed beneath the surface. Later dynasties rose in other regions and produced written histories of kings, battles, rituals, and state formation. Liangzhu had no surviving text to claim a place beside them. Its city remained hidden, and its fall looked less like the end of an early civilization than a gap before the better-known history of China began. Only modern excavation brought the walls, dams, rice fields, and cemeteries back into the same account. Once those discoveries were connected, Liangzhu could no longer be treated as an isolated jade-making culture that had disappeared for unknown reasons. It had been a regional state whose development, success, and decline belonged near the beginning of the long history of Chinese civilization. That recognition raises a larger question. If Liangzhu built a planned city, organized large hydraulic works, supported specialized industries, and maintained a clear political and ritual hierarchy before the traditional dynastic period, then the familiar starting point of Chinese civilization may need to be moved earlier and widened beyond the northern river valleys. The answer depends not only on what Liangzhu achieved, but on why its place in history was forgotten for so long, and what its recovery changes about the story that came after it. That question brings us back to the reason Liangzhu matters. It is not simply an ancient settlement with impressive jade objects. It changes where we look for the beginnings of Chinese civilization, what evidence we accept, and how we describe a period that existed long before historians could write down the names of rulers. For a long time, the standard story began in northern China. It focused on the Yellow River Valley, where later traditions placed the Xia dynasty, and where archaeologists found the major centres of the Shang and Zhou dynasties. This emphasis was understandable. The north produced early bronze cities, royal tombs, and the oracle bone inscriptions that preserve the earliest known mature Chinese writing. At Anyang, the late Shang capital, inscriptions record rulers, ancestors, military campaigns, harvests, sacrifices, and questions about the future. A society that leaves written records is much easier to place in a historical narrative. Liangzhu left no readable archive. Its leaders remain unnamed. Its language is unknown. We cannot connect an excavated grave with a ruler described in an ancient text, and we cannot follow a written list of wars or royal marriages. When researchers first found Liangzhu pottery, they were studying a culture that seemed to stand outside the familiar dynastic sequence. That made it easy to treat Liangzhu as an interesting regional tradition, rather than a civilization in its own right. The lower Yangtze was known for rice farming, black pottery and jade, but the scale of its political organization remained hidden. Without visible city walls or written records, the area appeared less central than the northern plains. The discoveries made during the last several decades changed that interpretation. Elite cemeteries revealed a strict social hierarchy. Mojiaoshan revealed monumental construction. The buried walls revealed a planned urban centre. Rice fields and storage areas revealed an economy capable of supporting a large population. The hydraulic system revealed organised labour operating across valleys, plains and waterways. When these findings are considered together, Liangzhu looks very different. UNESCO describes it as the centre of power and belief of an early regional state that existed from about 3300 to 2300 BCE. Its defining features included rice agriculture, social differentiation, a unified system of belief, urban planning, large earthen monuments, a complex water management network, and cemeteries arranged according to rank. This does not settle every debate about the word civilization. Archaeologists do not all use the term in exactly the same way. Some place greater emphasis on cities, others focus on the state, permanent inequality, monumental construction, specialist production, regional administration, or writing. Older definitions often treated writing as an essential requirement. Under that rule, Liangzhu would remain prehistoric and might be excluded from the category altogether. The difficulty is that writing is only one method of organising a complex society. Liangzhu's leaders coordinated water management, food collection, construction, craft production, ritual practice, and access to valuable goods without leaving a script that modern researchers can read. Their government may have used marks, tokens, oral records, measured containers, trained officials, or systems that have not survived. A dam does not become less complicated because nobody wrote a report about it. A city wall does not become a village fence because its builders left no royal inscription. The absence of writing limits what we know about Liangzhu, but it does not erase what its people built. The site therefore forces us to separate recorded history from social complexity. Shang China belongs to written history because its inscriptions can be read. Liangzhu belongs to archaeology because its evidence survives mainly in material form. Both can be studied as complex societies, although the kinds of questions we can answer are different. We know the names of Shang kings, but not the rulers of Liangzhu. We know some of the questions asked during Shang divination, but not the words spoken during Liangzhu ceremonies. We can identify Liangzhu's highest-ranking graves, yet we cannot say whether the people inside were called kings, chiefs, priests, or something with no exact modern equivalent. This uncertainty should not be treated as an invitation to invent convenient answers. Liangzhu is important enough without assigning names or titles that the evidence cannot support. Calling it an early regional state describes the scale of organisation visible in its remains. It does not claim that its political institutions were identical to those of later Chinese dynasties. The same caution is needed when speaking about continuity. Liangzhu existed within the territory of modern China and contributed to the long development of civilization in the region. Its rice economy, jade traditions, settlement systems and technical knowledge belong to Chinese prehistory. That does not mean there was one unbroken Liangzhu government that gradually turned into the later imperial state. The Liangzhu political centre collapsed around 2300 BCE. The city was abandoned, the elite burial system ended, and the earlier level of regional centralisation disappeared. Later states developed through new combinations of communities, technologies, political systems and cultural traditions. Some Liangzhu forms survived or were remembered, but much of their original meaning was lost. Jade provides the clearest example. Cong tubes and bee discs continue to appear in later China. Historical societies collected ancient examples, produced new versions, and gave them roles in their own ritual systems. Later texts connected the round disc and square tube with ideas about heaven and earth, but those explanations cannot automatically be applied to Liangzhu. What continued was the form and the recognition that the object was special. The original ceremony may have disappeared, the name may have changed. The people using it later could still understand that they were handling something ancient and important. This kind of continuity is common. A building shape, symbol, or object can survive while its meaning changes. Later generations do not simply receive the past. They select parts of it, forget others, and create new explanations. Liangzhu's legacy may therefore be better understood as one contribution among many, rather than the beginning of one straight line. Archaeology now shows that several regions participated in the formation of early Chinese civilization. Communities developed different forms of agriculture, craft production, ritual authority, and political organization in the Yellow River Basin, the Yangtze Valley, the northeast, the southeast, and other areas. Some centers became powerful and then disappeared. Others influenced neighbors. Populations moved. Objects traveled farther than the people who made them. Religious symbols crossed regional boundaries. Technologies spread and were adapted to new environments. The result was not one small culture expanding unchanged across the map. It was a long process of interaction among different societies. Liangzhu demonstrates that the lower Yangtze was already one of the major centers involved in that process more than 5,000 years ago. This broader model is sometimes described as Chinese civilization, having multiple origins or developing through interaction among several regional traditions. It replaces the older picture of civilization moving outward from a single northern core. Liangzhu does not remove the Yellow River from the story. It makes the story larger. The northern plains remained crucial. Millet agriculture, walled settlements, bronze production, political competition, and later dynastic states developed there. The Yangtze region followed a different course based heavily on rice, waterways, wetland settlement, and jade-centered ritual. These were not separate worlds. Exchange networks connected them long before written history. Liangzhu-style jade objects and symbols appeared beyond the immediate Taihu Basin. Materials and techniques moved between elite communities. Recent analysis of jade distributions continues to examine the relationship between Liangzhu Ancient City and other important centers such as Fuquancheng and Sidun. Some researchers describe Liangzhu as a centralized territorial state, while others consider whether major regional centers may have held more independent or parallel positions. Those debates are healthy. Calling Liangzhu a civilization does not mean every question about its government has been solved. Archaeologists still disagree about how directly the central city controlled distant settlements, how labour obligations were enforced, where all the jade originated, and whether the regional system operated through one dominant capital or a network of powerful centres. New discoveries can change the picture. A cemetery may reveal a previously unknown local elite, A workshop can show that an object was produced outside the capital. Chemical analysis may connect pottery or stone to an unexpected source. A newly identified dam can expand the known area of coordinated water management. This is why the history of Liangzhu cannot be reduced to one dramatic discovery. Shi Xingeng's work in 1936 identified the culture. The formal name followed in 1959. The elite cemeteries transformed ideas about social rank. Mojiashan revealed a monumental centre. The ancient city walls were confirmed in 2007. The hydraulic network was dated and mapped through later research. Each step changed the questions being asked. At first, archaeologists asked what kind of prehistoric culture had produced the black pottery. Later, they asked who could have controlled the jade. Then they asked whether Mojiashan belonged to a palace centre. Once the walls were found, they asked how the city was supplied. Once the dams were understood, they asked how early state authority had reshaped the entire region. The interpretation grew with the evidence. Liangzhu changed from a pottery culture into a jade culture, from a jade culture into a complex society, and from a complex society into one of the strongest known examples of early state formation in East Asia. An article introducing research on Chinese archaeology described Liangzhu as a state society, and noted that this interpretation could make it the earliest known state in China. The same discussion criticised older, text-centred narratives for treating major prehistoric centres such as Liangzhu and Shimao as peripheral. The phrase earliest state should still be used carefully. New excavations continue across China, and the dating and organisation of several prehistoric societies remain under study. Archaeology does not award a permanent certificate to the first site that appears to qualify. A new discovery can make the sequence more complicated. Liangzhu does not need to defeat every other early centre in a historical race. Its importance comes from the combination of evidence found in one region. It had a large capital, clear social ranking, elite control of rare goods, specialist production, major rice agriculture, planned water engineering, and a belief system expressed through standardized ritual objects. Very few sites of the same period preserve all of these features so clearly. Even when the upper structures have disappeared, the organization remains visible in the ground. The scale also places Liangzhu within the wider history of early civilizations. During the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE, complex urban societies were developing in several regions of the world. Mesopotamian cities built temples and irrigation systems. Ancient Egypt was becoming politically unified along the Nile. Communities in the Indus region were moving toward the urban centres that flourished later in the 3rd millennium BCE. Liangzhu developed independently within the environmental and cultural conditions of the lower Yangtze. It did not need stone pyramids, wheeled war chariots, or cuneiform tablets to qualify as complex. Its major achievements appeared in packed earth, controlled water, cultivated rice, and worked jade. This comparison helps correct another common mistake. Civilizations do not all pass through the same checklist in the same order. One region may develop writing before large-scale water engineering. Another may build cities while continuing to use stone tools. Bronze can become politically important in one society and remain secondary in another. Liangzhu's people worked without bronze tools on the scale later seen during the Shang period. They still built walls kilometers in length and dams that required millions of cubic meters of earth. Technological periods such as the Stone Age are useful labels, but they can make ancient societies sound simpler than they were. A polished stone axe can fell timber. Boats can carry large loads without wheeled carts. Oral administration can coordinate labour without written laws. Earth architecture can create monumental cities without stone blocks. The technologies were different from those of later states, not absent. Liangzhu also changes how rice is understood in early history. Rice was not merely a food associated with small southern villages. Intensive rice farming supported urban growth, specialist labour, social inequality, and state-level organisation. the lower Yangtze produced a political centre based on a crop and landscape very different from the millet-growing regions farther north. The water system shows the connection particularly well. Rice made dense settlement possible, but rice farming depended on predictable water. Managing water required labour. Organising labour strengthened central authority. Central authority gathered surplus, supported specialists, and built more infrastructure. The result was not inevitable. Other rice farming communities remained smaller and less unequal. At Liangzhu, environmental opportunity combined with political concentration. The same fields that supported the population also supported an elite able to remove enormous quantities of labour from ordinary household production. Jade added another level. It transformed stored food and organised labour into visible symbols of status. Grain fed the craftsperson. Boats transported the raw material. Abrasives and tools shaped the stone. Elite families controlled the finished object. Burial removed it from circulation and attached its value permanently to the dead. That system shows how economy, politics, and belief worked together. Liangzhu was not a city with separate departments for rice, religion, and public works. The same authority probably influenced all three. A ceremony involving jade could support a claim to rule. A ruler's claim could justify control of stored rice. Rice could feed dam workers. Successful dams could make the ruler's authority appear effective and necessary. Each part reinforced the others until environmental disruption and political stress broke the relationships holding them together. Remembering Liangzhu also means remembering the ordinary people whose names did not survive. The most beautiful jades draw attention because they are rare and carefully made. The city could not have existed without people whose possessions were ordinary, or whose graves have not been found. Farmers stood in wet fields through the growing season. Labourers carried baskets of earth to walls and dams. Boat crews moved stone and timber. Potters watched firing pits. Woodworkers replaced posts in damp buildings. Families processed rice, gathered fuel, repaired clothing, and cared for children. Their labour appears indirectly. It is present in the volume of a wall, the depth of a channel, the polish on a jade surface, and the grain found near a storehouse. The elite controlled the results, but they did not produce them alone. This matters when ancient civilizations are presented mainly through rulers and masterpieces. Liangzhu has no known royal names, which gives us an opportunity to begin with the system rather than a list of kings. We can ask how a city was fed, how people moved through it, how status was enforced, and how collective labour became elite power. We should also avoid turning Liangzhu into a perfect society, simply because it was technically impressive. Its dams protected communities, but building them required enormous labour. Its food systems supported specialists, but access to stored grain was unequal. Its ritual objects show artistic skill, but their distribution reveals sharp differences in rank. Civilization does not mean kindness, equality, or comfort. It describes a high level of social organisation. That organisation can solve large problems while giving some people far more authority than others. The fall of Liangzhu makes the same point. The society had managed water successfully for centuries. It had not defeated the environment permanently. Extreme rainfall and flooding appear to have played a major role in the end of the city, but the result depended on a system already tied closely to low fields, large infrastructure, and central coordination. Its collapse does not cancel its achievement, nor does its achievement make the collapse mysterious in the supernatural sense. Large societies can be both capable and vulnerable. The more people depend on one connected system, the more serious the consequences when several parts fail together. Modern recognition arrived slowly. Liangzhu was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List in 2019. The decision recognised its contribution to understanding the origins of Chinese civilization and identified it as an outstanding example of a prehistoric early state and urban civilization in the Yangtze Basin. World Heritage status did not suddenly make the site important. It gave international recognition to work that archaeologists had been carrying out for decades. It also increased the responsibility to preserve remains that are still vulnerable. Much of Liangzhu remains below the ground. That is often the safest place for it. Excavation exposes wood, seeds, compacted earth, and other materials to air, rain, and changes in temperature. A feature that survived 5,000 years underground can begin deteriorating after it is uncovered. Preservation therefore involves restraint. Archaeologists do not need to excavate every wall or grave. Future methods may recover information that current techniques cannot. Leaving part of the site untouched allows later researchers to ask questions that have not yet been imagined. Modern construction presents another problem. Hangzhou and the surrounding region continue to grow. Roads, housing, industry, farming, and tourism all place pressure on archaeological land. A buried dam may look like unused ground to someone planning a building project. A low ancient wall can be damaged before anyone realizes what it is. Remote sensing, geophysical survey, soil coring, digital mapping, chemical analysis, and experimental archaeology are helping researchers study the site with less destruction. In 2025, reports from Liangzhu described experiments designed to understand the grass-wrapped mud technique used in the ancient water system. Researchers are not simply admiring the structures, they are testing how the materials were prepared, carried, and assembled. Other recent work has examined stone tool production and distribution, changes in settlement layout, and the operation of the Tangshan waterworks. These studies continue to fill gaps between the grand monuments and daily economic activity. The public presentation of Liangzhu has also changed. Museums and archaeological parks now use reconstructed buildings, models, digital displays, and preserved excavation areas to explain features that are difficult to see on the ground. Visitors can examine jade objects closely while also learning where rice was stored, how the walls were built, and why channels crossed the city. This is important because Liangzhu's architecture does not provide the immediate effect of a standing stone ruin. A visitor may look across grass and water without realizing that the ground itself is the monument. The scale becomes clear only after the buried walls, platforms, and channels are mapped. The story is still developing. More than 350 sites associated with Liangzhu culture have been reported across the lower Yangtze region, and continuing work is examining how they were connected. Some may have been farming villages, others were craft centres, cemeteries, ports, or secondary political centres. Their relationships change through time. Future discoveries may show that authority was more centralised in one period and more distributed in another. They may also reveal more about ordinary diets, migration, health, childhood, and household organisation. Scientific methods can examine residues inside pottery, isotopes in teeth and bones, microscopic wear on tools, plant remains in sediment, and the chemical sources of jade or stone. None of these methods is likely to reveal the name of the first Liangzhu ruler. They can answer other questions that are just as useful. Where did a person grow up? What foods did they eat? Did they perform repetitive heavy labour? Did a pot come from a local workshop? Was jade transported from one source or several? Each answer makes the people less anonymous, even when their names remain unknown. The strongest lesson from Liangzhu is that history does not begin when writing begins. Writing changes the evidence, but people were building institutions, creating inequality, managing landscapes, and organising cities before surviving texts appeared. It also reminds us that important places can be forgotten without being unimportant. Liangzhu disappeared because its architecture settled into the earth, and its political system left no readable account. Later history concentrated elsewhere. The city became a field, then an archaeological question, and finally evidence that required a much larger revision. When we now speak about the beginnings of Chinese civilization, the image should not contain only millet fields and northern bronze cities. It should also include boats moving through the lower Yangtze, farmers working in rice paddies, Workers packing grass-wrapped clay into dams, craftspeople grinding jade, and families living on raised terraces between channels. There was no single morning when China became a civilization. The process occurred over a long period in several regions. Liangzhu represents one of the earliest and clearest stages of that development. Its people built a society that lasted for roughly 1,000 years. They created a capital suited to wetlands, supported tens of thousands of inhabitants across a regional network, and developed symbols recognized far beyond the city walls. They organized water with enough skill to make a difficult plain productive for generations. They also created a society with substantial inequality, strong central authority, and deep dependence on infrastructure. When environmental conditions moved outside the range their system could manage, the capital declined and the population dispersed. For most of the following 5,000 years, the city had no public voice. Its walls stayed underground. Its dams looked like natural ridges. Its rulers remained inside graves whose symbols could no longer be read. Archaeology did not recover every answer, and it never will. What it recovered was enough to place Liangzhu back near the beginning of the story. So, before we leave the lower Yangtze, think back to the question asked when this journey began. Had you heard of Liangzhu before tonight? If not, you now know why that absence is so surprising. This was not a minor village waiting for the better-known history of China to begin. It was an early state with a city, an agricultural economy, large public works, specialist production, elite ritual, and a regional system of power. And perhaps you can tell me one more thing. Where are you listening from, and which part of Liangzhu surprised you most? Was it the buried walls, the vast dams, the carefully worked jade, or the fact that a civilization of this scale could remain outside so many familiar accounts of the ancient world? If you found this journey interesting or relaxing, you can give the video a like, subscribe to Just About Earth, and share it with someone who enjoys discovering the parts of history that were left beneath the surface. For now, the fields above Liangzhu are quiet. The boats no longer pass through its water gates, and no workers carry rice toward Mojiaoshan. The city remains in the ground, protected in many places by the same earth that concealed it. We know it is there now. We know what its people built, how much labour their society could organise, and why their achievements require a wider account of early China. That does not restore their lost names, but it gives their civilization its proper place in history. Sleep well, fellow traveller, wherever you are listening from tonight.